The water here is the wrong color. That is the first thing you notice, drifting at the edge of sleep, at the edge of a world that vanished 66 million years ago. The color is not the deep, cold blue of the Atlantic you might know, not the pale turquoise of tropical shallows, not any shade of ocean still visible from the coastlines of the world you were born into. It is something older, something warmer, a thick amber green near the surface, where afternoon light from an ancient sun filters down in long, gentle columns. And below that, deeper, a trembling indigo that goes and goes without a bottom you can see. The temperature is wrong too. This ocean is warm, not uncomfortably so, but warm in the way of a bath left to cool just enough, warm in the way that makes your body remember how to let go, how to sink a little, how to stop holding itself upright. There is no cold here, no polar bite, no thermocline that would shock you awake. The water carries the same temperature at the surface as it does 100 feet below. And that single fact tells you more about how different this world is than any map could. You can hear things moving. Not clearly, not close. Sounds carry strangely in water. And these sounds are at the very edge of what you can detect, rather than at its center. A low displacement of water, somewhere beyond the green-gold curtain of light. A pressure change, faint as a held breath. Something very large turning slowly in the middle distance. The way large things turn when they are not hurrying, when they have no reason to hurry, when the sea belongs to them as completely as the land belongs to nothing now living. And you realize, still drifting, still descending into the particular quiet of this place, that you are not alone here, that you have never been alone in this sea, that this water, warm and ancient and endlessly patient, is full of things that no word in your language quite fits. You are in the Cretaceous Ocean. You are 90 million years in the past. And the ocean, unlike the land above it, does not sleep. When people think of the age of dinosaurs, they tend to think of land. Of great herds of sauropods moving through forests that smelled of pine resin and wet earth. Of predators like Tyrannosaurus rex haunting the tree line at dusk. Of a world that was fundamentally familiar even in its strangeness. A world of soil and weather and changing light. A world where the ground held firm beneath enormous feet. But the land was never the whole story. The Cretaceous period, that long sweep of time from roughly 145 million years ago to 66 million years ago, was defined as much by its oceans as by its continents, and those oceans were nothing like the ones that wrap the modern world. They were warmer, they were shallower in some places and terrifyingly deep in others. They had a chemistry all their own, shaped by volcanic venting and the slow dissolution of ancient rock and the steady respiration of creatures that have no living counterpart anywhere on this earth. The sea level during the Cretaceous was dramatically higher than it is today, not by meters but by hundreds of meters in some regions. This had a consequence that is difficult to fully imagine. It drowned the interior of North America. A warm, shallow body of water called the Western Interior Seaway stretched from what is now the Arctic Circle all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, dividing the continent entirely. Where Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma now grow crops in dry, landlocked plains, there was once ocean, warm, teeming, patient as geology. That inland sea was one of the most remarkable ecosystems in the history of life on this planet. And it was not alone. Similar warm, shallow seas covered much of Western Europe. Much of what would become Russia and the Middle East. Even the polar regions were ice-free. The ocean temperatures at the poles hovering 10 to 15 degrees Celsius above what they are today. The whole world was wrapped in a warmth that made the concept of a cold ocean essentially meaningless. Into that warm water, over the course of millions of years, a remarkable thing happened. Animals that had evolved on land decided to go back. This was not a plan. Evolution has no plans. But the sea was full of food, and the creatures that could access it had an advantage over those that could not. And over generations that stretched into millions of years, land animals returned to the water. Some went all the way, becoming fully aquatic, giving birth in the open ocean, never needing dry ground again. Others hovered at the boundary, comfortable in both worlds. And some became so perfectly adapted to the deep that their bodies lost all resemblance to the terrestrial ancestors from which they had come. The result was an ocean populated by creatures that looked, at first glance, like the sea life you might recognize from the modern world, but that was something stranger underneath. Not fish, not dolphins. Not sharks in any sense that modern biology would recognize. They were reptiles, most of them. Reptiles that still needed to breathe air and yet chose to live below the surface. Reptiles whose legs had become paddles, whose tails had become rudders, whose necks had stretched to lengths that defied easy explanation, whose jaws had widened into killing instruments of extraordinary efficiency. If you enjoy sleeping to stories like this one, consider subscribing. New stories arrive every week, and there will always be somewhere ancient and quiet waiting for you when you return. These are the ocean dinosaurs, as people call them, though the name is slightly imprecise. Technically, most of them were not true dinosaurs in the way the word is used by paleontologists. The true dinosaurs were mostly creatures of the land, but these animals lived in the same world, breathed the same ancient air, and died in the same great extinction that ended the age of giant reptiles. They are close enough to the dinosaurs in time and in spirit that the label sticks, even if the biology argues for finer distinctions. Tonight you are settling into their story. The Mosasaurs and the Plesiosaurs and the Ichthyosaurs and the Pliosaurs and the dozens of other creatures that made the Cretaceous Ocean the most alive body of water this planet has ever produced. The story of what hunted the deep when Tyrannosaurus Rex ruled the land above. The story of a sea that was full in ways the modern ocean can barely suggest. The water is warm, the light is very old. You are already sinking into it. Let yourself go. You are somewhere in the middle of what will one day be Kansas. But there is no Kansas here. There is no land at all. You are standing, or floating, at a depth of perhaps 30 feet, in a warm salt sea that stretches in every direction without interruption. The light comes down through the water in shifting sheets, amber and pale gold, the color of late afternoon translated into something liquid. The bottom, if you look down, is soft pale mud, nothing as firm as sand, nothing as hard as rock, just mud and the slow settling of particles from above, and the occasional disturbance where something has recently moved. This is the Western Interior Seaway, and it is nothing like what most people imagine when they picture ancient oceans. People tend to assume that prehistoric seas were deep, dark, abyssal, the sort of place where light does not reach, and where creatures move through permanent cold. But this sea was different. At its deepest point, the Western Interior Seaway reached only about 800 feet below the surface. For much of its breadth, it was considerably shallower than that. 100 feet. 50, in some areas near the coasts, barely deeper than a modern swimming pool. This shallowness had consequences that shaped everything living in it. Shallow water is warm water. Light reaches the bottom in shallow water, and where light reaches, photosynthesis happens. And where photosynthesis happens, there is the beginning of every food chain. The seaway was productive in the way that truly deep ocean is not, producing life at every level from the algae suspended near the surface to the soft-bodied invertebrates working through the mud below. It was, in the language that ecologists would use if they could go back and study it, a highly eutrophic system, rich, dense with nutrients, full, but the seaway was just one piece of the Cretaceous ocean story. Beyond its shallow reaches, the true ocean waited. The Tethys Sea, that ancient warm body of water that sat roughly where the Mediterranean now exists, was both older and deeper. The Proto-Atlantic was widening as the continents continued their slow drift. The Pacific, vaster than any ocean the modern world knows, wrapped around the far side of the globe, and all of these bodies of water shared one fundamental quality that distinguished them from the oceans of today: warmth. During the peak of the Cretaceous period, roughly 90 million years ago, global ocean temperatures were dramatically higher than they are in the present day. The surface waters of tropical seas may have reached 35 degrees Celsius. Temperatures that would stress modern coral reefs to the point of bleaching and death. The polar oceans, which today hover just above freezing, were closer to 10 or 15 degrees Celsius, warm enough that no permanent ice formed at the poles at all. The planet had no ice caps. Sea level was hundreds of meters higher than it is now as a result. Not because of melting ice, but because warm water physically expands and takes up more space. This warmth was not comfortable in the way that a warm day is comfortable. It was an ecological forcing mechanism. It changed what could live where. It affected the chemistry of the water, lowering the amount of dissolved oxygen that the ocean could hold. which had consequences for everything that breathed. It increased the rate of evaporation, which changed rainfall patterns on the continents. It altered the speed and direction of ocean currents. The Cretaceous world was a world running hot, and the sea was where that heat was most completely expressed. The chemistry of the Cretaceous ocean was different from today's in other ways too. The concentration of calcium carbonate in the water was higher, which favored certain kinds of shell-building organisms. Ammonites, those ancient cephalopods that looked something like coiled nautiluses, thrived in this environment. They came in sizes that defy easy imagining. Small ammonites were everywhere, spinning slowly through the water column, their chambered shells catching light like tiny architecture. But some species grew to extraordinary dimensions. There are fossil ammonites from the Cretaceous that measure nearly 2 meters in diameter. 2 meters, the size of a dining table, coiled into a perfect spiral, drifting through warm water as naturally as a leaf on a current. What you would not find in this ocean, if you were somehow dropped into it, are things so familiar to modern eyes that their absence would be disorienting. There are no kelp forests. Kelp, the great anchored seaweed of cold, temperate oceans, had not yet evolved. There are no coral reefs in the modern sense, complex tropical structures built by tiny animals over centuries. The reef-building corals of the Cretaceous were a different group, building in different shapes, responding to different water chemistry. In some areas, the reefs had collapsed entirely due to the extreme warmth and chemical changes of the ocean. The seascape you would see would be fundamentally alien: open water, soft-bottomed shallows, occasional fields of seagrasses that were only just beginning to evolve, and over it all a particular quality of light that came from a sun slightly younger and slightly different from the one that hangs over the modern world. Below the sunlit zone, the deeper water held its own mysteries. The Cretaceous ocean experienced periodic events that geologists call oceanic anoxic events, moments when vast regions of the deep ocean were stripped of dissolved oxygen. During these events, the deep water became poisonous. Animals that sank too deep, or that ventured into the wrong layer of the water column, would have found themselves in water that could not sustain them. Black, organic-rich sediments from these periods are preserved in rock around the world. Layers of ancient death compressed into stone. The currents that moved through this ocean were also different from the ones that circulate in modern seas. Today, the global ocean circulation pattern is driven partly by the sinking of cold, dense water at the poles, water that has been chilled by contact with polar ice. But in the Cretaceous, there was no polar ice. The circulation patterns that resulted were weaker and different in character, moving heat around the globe in ways that did not strongly stratify the water column the way modern circulation does. The result was an ocean that was more uniformly warm from surface to considerable depth. Into this warm, deep, ancient world, life moved with an exuberance that is almost impossible to picture now. The Cretaceous ocean was not a quiet place. It was not the empty blue expanse that modern deep ocean often is. It was a crowded, layered, intensely competitive ecosystem. Every depth had its specialists. Every temperature zone had its hunters and its hunted. The water was dense with life, in a way that has not been seen since. Not because life has diminished since then, but because the specific configuration of warm, shallow seas and warm, deep oceans and the particular chemistry of that ancient water created conditions uniquely suited to the proliferation of large animals. Fish were everywhere. Not the fish you know today, though some ancient fish lineages were present. But the dominant fishes of the Cretaceous seas were different species, different families, adapted to different conditions. Some were enormous. Siphactinus, a creature that most people have never heard of, was a giant predatory bony fish that could reach lengths of 6 meters. It looked something like a tarpon grown to monstrous proportions, with a large mouth filled with curved teeth and a body built for speed. Siphactinus was not a reptile. It was not an ocean dinosaur in any sense, but it was one of the dominant large predators of the western interior seaway, and its fossils are found across the American mid-continent in numbers that speak to how common it once was. There is a remarkable fossil of Siphactinus that sits in a museum in Hays, Kansas. The fossil shows not just the skeleton of the animal itself, but preserved inside its body cavity, another fish, a fully intact fish, nearly 6 feet long, that Siphactinus had swallowed whole and was in the process of digesting when it died. The swallowed fish was so large, paleontologists believe it may have ruptured internal organs, killing the predator even as the predator consumed it. It is a death preserved in stone, a moment of overreach captured in exquisite detail. But there is a stranger detail still. Evidence found in Belgium shows a mosasaur fossil that had swallowed a large Siphactinus-like fish, which itself still contained a smaller fish inside it. 3 animals in sequence, each the prey of the last, all preserved together. Sharks were present too. Not the great white sharks of modern horror, but something different. The Ginju shark, whose scientific name is Cretoxyrina mantelli, was a common predator in the western interior seaway and other Cretaceous seas. It grew to 7.5 meters, roughly the size of a large great white. Its teeth were different from modern shark teeth, smoothly pointed rather than serrated, designed more for gripping and tearing than for the sawing motion of modern apex sharks. Paleontologists have found fossil mosasaur bones with bite marks that match Cretoxyrina teeth, which tells us that even the great sea reptiles were not immune to the attentions of ancient sharks. The ocean was a world of layers. Every creature was both predator and potential prey. Turtles moved through this water too, enormous ones. The largest turtle that ever lived, Archelon iscaros, swam through the waters of the western interior seaway, with a body measuring 4.5 meters from beak to tail. To put that in perspective, Archelon was roughly the size of a small car. Its shell was not the rigid dome of modern turtles, but a framework of thick, bony struts covered in leathery skin, lighter and more flexible than the armored shell of its smaller relatives. Archelon had a hooked beak and powerful jaws, and it probably fed on soft-bodied prey, and perhaps the jellyfish-like creatures that drifted through the warm water in uncountable numbers. There was also Protostega, another ancient sea turtle of this period, and this one stranger still. Protostega had essentially no hard shell at all, where a modern turtle has a solid dome of bone fused to its spine and ribs. Protostega had only a thin, ribbed framework, the barest structural suggestion of what a shell might eventually become. It was as if evolution had not quite decided yet how to finish the design. Protostega was real. It was alive. It swam through these same warm waters with its ribbon-thin framework exposed, not hidden beneath armor, making it look less like a turtle and more like something between a turtle and something that had not yet decided what it was going to be. The ocean floor, in the shallower parts of the seaway, held its own communities of animals. Bivalves, clams, and oysters and their relatives colonized the soft sediment. Strange forms of rudest bivalves built small, reef-like structures in some warmer areas. Echinoderms, the family that includes modern sea urchins and sea stars, worked through the sediment in their methodical way. And microscopic life was everywhere. The planktonic organisms that form the base of every ocean food web, drifting in the sunlit upper layers, feeding on light and nutrients, themselves fed upon by everything larger. The plankton of the Cretaceous ocean was notably different from today's. The microscopic calcifying organisms called coccolithophores were abundant and varied. When these tiny creatures died, their calcium carbonate shells sank to the ocean floor and accumulated over millions of years in layers hundreds of meters thick. This material eventually became chalk. The White Cliffs of Dover in England are made of it. The great chalk formations of the American Great Plains are made of it. Everywhere you find white chalk in the geologic record, you are looking at the compressed shells of countless trillions of microscopic Cretaceous ocean organisms, a civilization of plankton that lasted 80 million years and left its mark in every corner of the ancient world. This, then, was the stage. Warm, full, productive in ways that no modern ocean quite matches. A sea that reached into the hearts of continents that today are dry. A sea without ice at its poles, without cold deep water cycling up from below, without the fish and corals and kelp and sharks that we associate with the word ocean today. A sea that was utterly its own thing, unprecedented and unrepeated, shaped by conditions that have not existed since. Into this sea, in wave after wave over the course of millions of years, animals came. They came from the land, they came from the rivers and the coasts. They came from evolutionary paths that had been building toward the ocean for generations without knowing it. each small change accumulating, each advantageous adaptation preserved, until one day, after enough time had passed, what had been a land animal was a sea animal, and the transition was complete. The creatures that resulted from these transitions are the ones you came here to hear about. They are waiting in the deeper chapters of this story, in the green-gold light of the shallow seaway and the darker water beyond. You will meet them one by one. You will learn how they moved and what they ate and how they were built. You will learn the things about them that most people never hear, the facts that paleontologists have only recently uncovered, the mysteries that the fossil record has only partially answered. For now, let the warm water hold you. Let the ancient light settle around you. The world before memory is very quiet at this hour, and the sea here has all the time in the world. There is no hurry. There is nowhere else to be. The Cretaceous ocean breathes around you, slow and warm, and the creatures in it are already beginning to move toward you out of the deep. Before we can meet the individual animals that ruled this sea, we need to understand something that seems almost paradoxical the more you think about it. Almost every major creature in this ocean was not born here. The Ichthyosaurs, the Plesiosaurs, the Pliosaurs, the Mosasaurs, the marine crocodilians that swam alongside them, all of them descended from land animals. Every single one. The ocean, for all its ancient dominance on this planet, did not produce these animals from within itself. It received them. They chose to come back. Life began in the ocean. That much is established science. For the first 3.5 billion years of life on Earth, everything was aquatic. The ocean was where life lived, where it diversified, where it built its first complex structures. And then, roughly 375 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. Fish began to breathe air. Fish began to develop fins that could be used as rudimentary limbs. Fish began, generation by generation, to pull themselves out of the water and survive, however briefly, on land. This transition from water to land is one of the most studied events in evolutionary biology. Over millions of years, what had been fish became amphibians, and what had been amphibians became reptiles, and what had been reptiles began to diversify in ways that no fish had ever diversified before. They developed waterproof skin that could resist desiccation. They developed eggs with shells that could be laid in dry places. They developed body temperatures regulated by the sun rather than by the surrounding water, and they spread over millions of years across every continent, filling niches on land that had never existed before they arrived. But something happened that no one living in those early days of terrestrial life could have predicted. After going to all that evolutionary trouble to move onto land, some of those land animals decided to go back into the water. Not all of them, not most of them, but certain lineages, at certain moments, made the journey in reverse. Abandoning the terrestrial world they had spent hundreds of millions of years adapting to and returning to the ocean that life had left so long before. Why would they do this? The answer is resources. The ocean, especially the warm, shallow Cretaceous ocean with its extraordinary productivity, was full of food, fish in astronomical numbers, squid and their relatives, ammonites, soft-bodied invertebrates. And for a land animal with the right body plan, the right metabolic rate, the right temperament for the water, the potential rewards were enormous. A reptile that could hunt fish had access to food sources that no land predator could touch. But returning to the ocean is not a simple process. It takes millions of years of small changes, small adaptations, each one preserved because it helped the animal survive and reproduce. The limbs have to change. The tail has to change. The skull has to change. The ability to hold breath longer. The ability to navigate by senses other than smell and sight. The ability to regulate buoyancy. All of these things had to evolve, and they did, in different lineages at different times, in ways that parallel each other without being identical. What is remarkable is that this happened not once, but multiple times, independently. The Ichthyosaurs evolved their return to the sea separately from the Plesiosaurs. The Mosasaurs evolved their return to the sea separately from both of those groups. Marine crocodilians evolved their return to the sea separately again. Each time, evolution found a slightly different solution to the problem of living in water with a body plan designed for land. And each time, The result was an animal that could not have been predicted from its ancestors. There is a creature called Nothosaurus that lived before the main age of these great sea reptiles, during the Triassic period, and it provides a window into what these transitions looked like in their early stages. Nothosaurus was not fully aquatic. It could come ashore, in the way that modern sea lions can come ashore, pulling its body over rocks and beaches on limbs that still functioned on land. It was a competent swimmer, propelling itself through coastal waters with webbed feet. Its skull was long and narrow, its teeth interlocked when its jaws closed in a way that was perfect for gripping slippery fish. It hunted in the shallows, but Nothosaurus still needed land in ways that fully aquatic animals do not. Evidence from its fossils suggests that, like modern sea turtles, it came ashore to lay eggs. It could not give birth in the water. It was caught between two worlds, adapted to both but fully at home in neither. And in that in-between state, you can see the shape of the evolutionary journey, the ancient version of what the Plesiosaurs and Mosasaurs would eventually become after millions more years of refinement and commitment to the sea. The Plesiosaurs descended from animals like Nothosaurus, or at least from animals in the same broad lineage. Over time, they became more aquatic. Their limbs transformed from feet with toes into paddles with multiple shortened finger bones distributed across the span of a flipper. Their tails shortened. Their bodies became more torpedo-shaped. They lost the ability to come ashore entirely. They were committed to the water, fully and finally, and they gave birth to live young in the open ocean, never needing the land again except as a boundary they occasionally swam near. The Ichthyosaurs took a different path. They went further, faster, in geological terms. By the time the Ichthyosaurs are well represented in the fossil record, they already look remarkably like modern dolphins, not because they are related to dolphins, but because the same ocean environment selected for the same basic body plan. When you need to move fast through water and surface to breathe, evolution finds a solution that looks something like a dolphin, whether you started as a fish, a land reptile, or a distant ancestor of a mammal. This convergence, different animals arriving at similar shapes through different paths, is one of the most beautiful patterns in evolutionary biology. The Mosasaurs came last of all the major groups, arriving in the late Cretaceous when the other sea reptiles were already established. And they took a different route still. They were related to modern monitor lizards and to snakes. Imagine a monitor lizard, that long-bodied, powerful-limbed reptile with its flickering forked tongue and its muscular tail, and then imagine it returning to the sea. Imagine its limbs shortening and widening into paddles. Imagine its tail deepening and flattening. Imagine its body growing longer and longer still, and longer beyond that, until what was a lizard has become something that fills your whole field of view in the water. Each of these lineages, despite starting from the same basic terrestrial reptile body plan and ending up in the same ancient ocean, ended up looking radically different from one another. The Ichthyosaurs looked like dolphins. The long-necked Plesiosaurs looked like nothing on Earth today, or ever since. The Pliosaurs looked like crocodiles crossed with sharks. The Mosasaurs looked like serpents given enormous bulk and the ambitions of whales. All of them lived in the same sea, in the same geological period. All of them breathing air. All of them descended from land animals. All of them utterly different from each other in form and strategy. How did this happen? How can the same basic problem live in water, hunt successfully, survive, produce such wildly divergent solutions? The answer has to do with the ecological niches that were available. The ocean, like any ecosystem, is divided into feeding zones: surface hunters, midwater hunters, bottom feeders, open water pursuit predators, ambush specialists, prey on fish, prey on shellfish, prey on other reptiles, prey on anything unlucky enough to come within reach. Different body plans were solutions to different ecological problems. And because the Cretaceous ocean was so productive and so varied, there was room for all of them. The result was an ocean that was stratified vertically in a way you can almost imagine if you think of a modern ecosystem with its multiple predator types. Sharks at one level, large fish at another, dolphins at a third, killer whales above all of them. Now take that arrangement and replace every single animal with something older, stranger, and in some cases much larger, and you begin to approach the reality of the Cretaceous Sea. There is something else worth knowing about these animals before we meet them individually. Several things about them are still being discovered, still being revised, still being argued about in journals and at conferences. The picture that science has of the Cretaceous ocean is not complete. It is not even close to complete. Every few years, a new fossil is found that changes what we thought we knew about how one of these creatures moved. What it ate, how it reproduced, what color it might have been. The ocean of 90 million years ago is not a closed book. It is a book still being written, one fossil at a time. Some of what you will hear in the chapters ahead was not known 20 years ago. Some of it was discovered in the last decade. Some of the most surprising facts about these animals are the ones that overturned long-held assumptions, the ones that made paleontologists look at a bone they had studied for years and realize they had been reading it wrong. But here is something that will not change, no matter how many new fossils are found. The sense of what this ocean was, the warmth of it, the density of life within it, the way that every layer of the water column was occupied by something large and effective and specialized for exactly what it was doing. The Cretaceous ocean was not a backdrop, it was a world as complete and as complex as any that has existed on this planet before or since. And the shapes that moved through it were unlike anything the modern ocean has produced. The shapes that should not exist, and yet did. The shapes that the water and time and the patient logic of natural selection built to. The water is warm. Let yourself settle a little deeper. The first of them is already moving toward you through the green-gold light, and it looks, from a distance, almost exactly like something you know. But it is not. If you are still with us, drifting through these ancient waters, welcome. If this is the kind of story that helps you find rest, consider subscribing to the channel. New stories like this one arrive every week, and there will always be somewhere quiet and ancient waiting for you when you return. Sleep well, and we will continue. Something is moving above you. Not below, not at the same depth, but above, cutting the surface of the water and diving back down in a smooth arc. You catch the shape of it for only a moment before it moves beyond the range where the light is clear. Long. Streamlined. A body built for speed in water, the way a needle is built for speed, through fabric, all taper and intention, leaving almost no disturbance behind it as it goes. For just a second you think, dolphin, but you are 90 million years in the past. Dolphins will not exist for another 80 million years. What you just saw was something older. Ichthyosaurs were among the first large reptiles to return to the sea. And they were the most committed to that return. By the time the Cretaceous period was fully underway, the Ichthyosaurs had been ocean creatures for well over 100 million years. They had been in the water so long, adapting and readapting over such immense spans of time, that by the Jurassic and early Cretaceous their bodies had become almost perfectly fish-like. Not because they were fish, not because their ancestors had been fish for a very long time, but because the ocean, given sufficient generations to work with, reshapes everything that enters it toward the same efficient forms. The Ichthyosaur body plan is a study in convergent evolution, which is the process by which unrelated animals end up looking similar because they face similar problems and the same range of solutions is available to them. A dolphin today, an Ichthyosaur 90 million years ago, and the first fish hundreds of millions of years before that. All of them solved the problem of fast movement through water with roughly the same answer. A long, smooth, tapering body, paired fins at the sides for stability and steering, a vertical tail fin for propulsion, a breathing hole or passage positioned for easy surfacing. The ocean produces this shape reliably, from whatever raw material it is given, because this shape works. But if you looked closely at an ichthyosaur, you would see the differences. The tail fin was vertical, like a fish tail, and this required the tail to move side to side rather than up and down, as a dolphin's fluke does. The fins along the sides were not paired in quite the same configuration as a fish's fins. The skull, if you could see inside the streamlined exterior, was made of reptile bones arranged in a reptile pattern, not the skull of a fish or a mammal. And the ichthyosaur still breathed air. It had nostrils, it surfaced, it inhaled, and then it dove again. There is a fact about ichthyosaur eyes that most people have never heard, and it is one of the most startling facts in all of paleontology. The largest ichthyosaur known to science, a species called Temnodontosaurus, had eyes. Eyes of extraordinary, almost implausible size. The fossilized eye rings, which are bony structures that supported the eyes in life, measure approximately 30 centimeters in diameter. That is nearly a foot across. To put this in context, the largest eyes of any known animal alive today belong to the colossal squid, at approximately 27 centimeters. Temnodontosaurus had larger eyes than that. Temnodontosaurus had, so far as the fossil record tells us, the largest eyes of any animal ever known to have lived. Why would any animal need eyes that large? The answer is almost certainly light. Large eyes gather more light, and more light means the ability to see in conditions where smaller-eyed animals are effectively blind. Deep water is one of those conditions. At depth, even in the warm, productive Cretaceous ocean, light drops off quickly. Below a few hundred feet, the water is profoundly dim. Below 1,000 feet, it approaches darkness. An animal that could still hunt in those conditions, that could still see the pale shapes of prey in water that was nearly lightless, had an enormous advantage over anything that needed brighter conditions. Evidence from ichthyosaur fossils suggests that some species were capable of deep dives, reaching depths that the light never reaches. The bone structure of certain specimens shows features associated with deep diving, the same kinds of structural adaptations seen in modern sperm whales and elephant seals that regularly dive to extraordinary depths. Some researchers believe that large ichthyosaurs may have been capable of diving to depths of 1,500 feet or more, following squid and fish into the dark water where most other predators could not follow. There is something else about ichthyosaurs that was discovered in a remarkable series of fossil finds, and that changed the way paleontologists understood them. Several ichthyosaur fossils have been found that preserve the skin, or at least an impression of the skin, in addition to the skeleton. These soft tissue impressions are rare in the fossil record and deeply valuable. What they show is something that paleontologists did not expect. Ichthyosaurs appear to have been countershaded. Dark on the top, light on the bottom. This is exactly the coloration pattern of modern dolphins, modern sharks, modern tuna. It serves the same purpose in all of them. From above, the dark back blends with the deep water below. From below, the pale belly blends with the light sky above. Countershading makes an animal harder to see from any direction. This discovery was significant, not just because it told us something about ichthyosaur appearance, but because it told us something about their ecology. Countershading is useful to animals that live in open water and spend time at the surface or in the upper light zone. It is useful to animals that hunt by sight in well-lit conditions. It suggested that ichthyosaurs were not exclusively deep-diving animals, but spent significant time hunting in the shallower, better-lit layers of the ocean. They were flexible. They could go deep when they needed to, and hunt in the shallows when opportunity presented itself. Ichthyosaurs also give us some of the most poignant fossils in all of paleontology. Several specimens have been found that preserve not just one animal, but two: an adult, and inside the body cavity of the adult, the skeleton of a young ichthyosaur. At first, when these were discovered, paleontologists assumed the adults had eaten the juveniles. The small skeleton inside the large one must be a recently swallowed meal. But closer examination showed that the skeletons of these juveniles were oriented correctly for birth rather than for ingestion. The adult had been pregnant. The young ichthyosaur was in the process of being born when both died, and both were preserved together in the stone. This tells us that ichthyosaurs gave birth to live young in the open ocean, just as modern dolphins and whales do. They did not come ashore to lay eggs. They could not. Their bodies were too committed to the water. Instead, they bore their offspring directly into the sea, probably tail first as modern dolphins do, so the young animal could begin breathing before it was fully free of its mother. The birth happened in warm water, surrounded by the same ancient sea that would be the young animal's entire world from the first moment of its life. But there is something about the ichthyosaurs that is often left out of the stories people tell about Cretaceous sea creatures. Something that changes the picture of this ancient ocean in an important way. Ichthyosaurs did not survive to the end of the Cretaceous. They went extinct approximately 94 million years ago, roughly 30 million years before the asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs. By the time Tyrannosaurus rex was ruling the land, by the time the Mosasaurs were at the height of their power, the Ichthyosaurs were already gone. The last of them died in what appears to have been an ecological collapse. possibly linked to changes in the ocean environment that disrupted the food chains they depended on. What happened to the ichthyosaurs is still debated. Some researchers point to the oceanic anoxic events of the mid-Cretaceous, those episodes of oxygen depletion in the deep water that would have devastated the prey species that ichthyosaurs depended on. Others point to the rise of new competitors, particularly the mosasaurs that were just beginning their own ascent at the time the ichthyosaurs disappeared. Still others believe it was a combination of factors. The kind of slow squeeze that does not have a single cause, but accumulates from several directions at once. What we can say is that the ichthyosaurs, the oldest and in some ways the most perfectly adapted of all the great Cretaceous sea reptiles, did not make it to the end. The ocean they had shaped themselves to fit changed around them, and they could not change fast enough in return. The fossils they left behind are exquisite. The impressions of skin, the preserved births, the enormous eye rings of Temnodontosaurus. But the animals themselves vanished from the sea tens of millions of years before the story of the Cretaceous ocean reached its end. By the time the ichthyosaurs were gone, the ocean was already filling with new shapes. The Plesiosaurs, which had been sharing the Mesozoic ocean with the ichthyosaurs for millions of years, continued to thrive. The mosasaurs were just beginning their extraordinary rise to dominance. The sharks were diversifying. The seaway was full. The extinction of the ichthyosaurs left a hole in the ocean's ecology, and that hole would be filled by other things. You watch the last ichthyosaur shape disappear into the middle distance, moving with that effortless speed that the water has given it. The wake it leaves is smooth, dying quickly, leaving no trace. The animal is gone before you have fully processed its passing. That is how it always is with the ichthyosaurs in the fossil record. A brilliant presence, a long history, and then a silence. The water closes over the space they occupied, and something else moves in. The warm ocean holds you. The ichthyosaurs have passed through, and the silence after them is the kind that only comes when something enormous has just left. You remain in the water where they swam, breathing slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the middle distance, waiting. Something else is coming. You can feel it in the small movements of the current, something built differently from the streamlined shape you just watched pass. Something with a much longer neck. The shape that comes toward you out of the warm green distance is difficult to make sense of at first. Your eyes try to categorize it, reaching for the nearest familiar thing and finding nothing that fits. It has a body, a broad, heavy body, roughly oval, moving through the water with a kind of steady undulation that is neither the side-to-side sweep of a fish nor the up-and-down flex of a dolphin, but something older than either. Extending from that body is a neck, and the neck is wrong in a way that takes a moment to absorb. Too long. Much too long. The kind of long that seems like a mistake until you understand what it is for. This is a plesiosaur, or more precisely, an elasmosaurid plesiosaur, the long-necked branch of a family of marine reptiles that dominated the Mesozoic oceans for over 150 million years. And the neck that trails out ahead of it as it moves, that long, pale column of muscle and bone, is its most extraordinary and most debated feature. In the species Elasmosaurus platurus, the neck contains 72 vertebrae. 72. No other animal in the history of life on Earth has been documented to have as many neck vertebrae as Elasmosaurus. The human neck contains 7. Giraffes have 7. Even the most long-necked modern animals manage their remarkable reach with the same small number of neck bones. Elasmosaurus used 72. The neck of Elasmosaurus was not just long by the standards of other Cretaceous animals. It was long by the standards of any animal that has ever been documented. In absolute terms, estimates based on fossil specimens suggest the neck alone was nearly 7 meters, more than half the total body length of the animal. To picture this, imagine an animal 16 meters long, roughly the length of a large school bus. And then imagine that more than half of that length was neck. The head, at the end of this neck, was small. The eyes were large. The jaws held slender, interlocking teeth, the kind of teeth that work like a cage to trap small, slippery prey, rather than the kind that cut or crush. For a long time, the very first Elasmosaurus skeleton to be described created a famous confusion in paleontology. When Edward Drinker Cope, the legendary and occasionally reckless 19th-century American fossil hunter, first described the animal in 1868, he made an error that became notorious. He reconstructed the skeleton with the head on the wrong end. He placed the head on the tail, and the tail where the head should have been, because he could not quite believe that a neck could be as long as what the bones in front of him were describing. His rival Othniel Charles Marsh pointed out the mistake, and the resulting embarrassment became one of the defining moments in the fierce and sometimes personal competition between the two men that historians call the Bone Wars. But the question of why the neck was so long is one that has never been fully settled. Several theories have been proposed over the years, and each has its advocates. The oldest theory, and in some ways the most intuitive, is that the long neck allowed the plesiosaur to stalk fish from a distance, approaching a school of fish with its body held well back, and only the small head and neck moving forward silently. A school of fish watching for predators watches for the shape of a predator, and the small head of an elasmosaurid moving slowly through the water might not have triggered the alarm response the way a larger shape would. The neck was, in this theory, a way of delivering the jaws to where the food was without alerting the food. Another theory proposes that the neck was used laterally, sweeping sideways through schools of fish, the way a bird swings its beak to catch insects. The teeth of elasmosaurids are designed for trapping, not cutting, and a sideways sweep through a dense school of small fish could net several at once if the movement was fast enough. There is evidence from the structure of the neck vertebrae that lateral movement was easier than vertical movement for these animals, which supports this theory. A third possibility, and one that has grown in scientific credibility in recent decades, involves the ocean floor. Perhaps elasmosaurids fed not on fast-moving schools of surface fish, but on bottom-dwelling animals, using the long neck to reach down toward the sediment and disturb or capture the invertebrates and slow-moving fish that lived there. Some specimens show evidence of gastroliths, smooth stones found in the stomach region, which could have served as ballast to help the animal maintain neutral buoyancy while feeding along the bottom. If true, the long neck was not a hunting tool for swift prey, but a delicate instrument for precise, shallow bottom feeding in calm water. There is something else about plesiosaurs that was discovered relatively recently and that changed the way many paleontologists thought about their biology. A remarkable specimen of a smaller plesiosaur called Polycotylus latipinis, found in Kansas and described in a paper published in 2011, preserved inside the body of the adult, not multiple small embryos, but a single very large one. The embryo was approximately 70% the size of a modern newborn of proportionally comparable proportions. It was very large. The evidence suggested not the birth of multiple small offspring, as most reptiles produce, but the birth of a single, large, well-developed young animal. This is significant because it suggests that at least some plesiosaurs invested heavily in individual offspring the way modern whales and dolphins do, rather than producing many small young the way most reptiles do. Large offspring that require significant maternal investment are usually associated with some degree of parental care after birth. The researchers who described the Polycotylus specimen suggested that plesiosaurs may have cared for their young, as dolphins and whales do, perhaps traveling in small family groups with the mother protecting and guiding the calf for a period after birth. If this is correct, plesiosaurs were not solitary ocean wanderers, but social animals with bonds between individuals. Plesiosaurs may also have been warm-blooded, or at least warmer than typical reptiles. Analysis of the oxygen isotopes preserved in plesiosaur bones has suggested that the body temperatures of some species were higher than the surrounding water, which would require internal heat generation rather than external thermoregulation. A warm-blooded plesiosaur would have had significant advantages in the open ocean, where water temperatures varied with depth and latitude, and where the ability to maintain a consistent body temperature regardless of external conditions would have been enormously useful. In the species Styxosaurus snowi, one of the elasmosaurids of the western interior seaway, the neck was so long that it constituted more than half the total body length. The head of Styxosaurus, perched at the end of this extraordinary structure, was small enough to look almost vestigial. The total length of the animal approached 12 meters. The neck alone was perhaps 6.5 meters. Imagine moving through the water with a neck longer than a full-grown giraffe is tall, and you begin to approach the reality of this animal. The neck would have been held roughly horizontal in the water, not raised up in the sea serpent posture of old reconstructions. The musculature to hold such a length of neck upright would have been prohibitive. Instead, the neck trailed or swept, held near level by the water, capable of motion but not of high-speed strikes. There is something hypnotic about the movement of a long-necked plesiosaur, as it has been reconstructed from fossil evidence and modern biomechanical modeling. The paddles, 4 of them, working in a synchronized rowing motion, produce a smooth forward translation of the body. The body itself is relatively rigid, not flexing the way a fish flexes, not pumping up and down the way a dolphin pumps, and from the front of that steadily moving body, the neck extends and moves independently, slow arcs and sweeps, searching, testing the water ahead. The overall impression is of something that has found a way to hunt that does not look like hunting, something so unhurried and so quiet that you might mistake it for drifting until its jaws close around something and the transaction is complete. The Plesiosaur family included not just the long-necked elasmosaurids, but also a shorter-necked group called the polycotylids, and the relationship between the two groups is one of the threads running through the ecology of the Cretaceous Sea, where the long-necked forms specialized in slow, precise feeding that used the neck as a tool. The shorter-necked forms appear to have been more agile pursuit predators, closer to the Pliosaurs in their basic hunting strategy. Different niches, different solutions, the same basic body plan, adapted in different directions by the same ocean. You watch the elasmosaurid plesiosaur move past, its neck describing a slow underwater arc as it turns, and you notice how little disturbance it makes. For something 12 meters long, it is remarkably quiet in the water. The paddles do their work with an efficiency that leaves almost nothing behind. The neck moves. The small head pauses. Then the whole animal turns with a gradual, easy sweep that takes it out of your field of view. In the deep water behind where it has gone, you can sense other presences, other shapes. The Plesiosaur family was numerous in the Cretaceous Sea. Dozens of species distributed across every ocean, some with necks even longer than the one you just watched, some with necks short enough to be startling by comparison. All of them descended from a single returning lineage. All of them shaped by the same warm water and the same ancient light. The water moves gently in the wake of the passing plesiosaur, that subtle displacement of ancient ocean, warm and slow. Your eyes follow the space where the long neck disappeared. Somewhere beyond the curtain of green-gold water, the animal is still moving, still searching, still drawing its impossible neck through the warm Cretaceous Sea. And somewhere below that, in the darker water, something very different is about to surface. Something with a short neck and a very large head. Something that hunts the way a hammer strikes, not the way a needle searches. The animal that rises from the deeper water is built on a different logic, entirely from the plesiosaur you just watched pass. There is no long neck here. There is barely a neck at all. What there is, instead, is a head. A head of proportions that reframe your understanding of what heads are allowed to be. It is attached directly to a wide, muscular body by what can only be described as a suggestion of a neck, a brief transition between the enormous skull and the barrel of the torso that gives the impression not of a connection, but of one thing ending and an even larger thing beginning. This is a pliosaur, the short-necked branch of the plesiosaur family tree, and it represents one of the most powerful predators in the history of ocean life. Pliosaurs were not a single species, but a group that diversified over millions of years, from the Jurassic into the Cretaceous, producing animals at multiple size ranges with different specializations. But what they shared, in every member of the group, was that head. That disproportionate, overwhelming head, built around jaws of extraordinary length and power. The best-known pliosaur, at least in popular culture, is Lioperodon, a Jurassic form that appeared in documentary television and was promptly and dramatically exaggerated in its size. Real Liopleurodon, as best as the fossil record allows us to determine, was a large and formidable animal, probably reaching 8 to 10 meters in length, with a skull of roughly 1.5 meters. This is still an extraordinary animal. A skull 1.5 meters long, filled with teeth the size and approximate shape of large bananas, is not something you would want to encounter in the water, but it is a different proposition from the 25-meter monster that appeared on screen. The true record for pliosaur size appears to belong to a different animal altogether. In 2006, an expedition to the remote Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard well inside the Arctic Circle, made a discovery that changed the understanding of how large pliosaurs could grow. The researchers found the remains of an enormous Jurassic pliosaur, now nicknamed the Monster, belonging to a species called Predator X, or more formally, Pliosaurus funke. The skull of this animal, when it was eventually excavated and studied, measured nearly 2.5 meters in length, 2.5 meters of skull, filled with teeth arranged in a configuration designed for seizing and holding large prey. If the skull-to-body ratio, typical of pliosaurs, applies to this specimen, the total body length of Predator X would have been somewhere between 10 and 13 meters. The bite force has been estimated by researchers using computer modeling of the skull mechanics, and the numbers are startling. The bite force of Predator X is estimated to have exceeded that of Tyrannosaurus rex, one of the most powerful biters known from the terrestrial fossil record. The same ocean that gave us the delicate, long-necked Plesiosaurs also produced this, an animal whose entire body was organized around the act of biting. The Cretaceous Pliosaurs were somewhat smaller than the great Jurassic forms, but still formidable. Kronosaurus queenslandicus, found in Australia and named for the Greek Titan who devoured his own children, was a Cretaceous pliosaur that reached lengths of 9 to 10 meters, with a skull nearly 2 meters long. Kronosaurus is often described as having teeth like bananas. But this description, while evocative, understates their character. The teeth of Kronosaurus were circular in cross-section, robust and pointed, and at the larger end of the jaw they were thick enough and long enough to give the impression of small railroad spikes. They were not cutting teeth. They were piercing and gripping teeth, designed to penetrate and hold prey that could not be easily chewed. What did plesiosaurs eat? The teeth give us one answer. The stomach contents of some specimens give us another. Large plesiosaurs ate large things. Long-necked plesiosaurs were on the menu. The fossil record contains plesiosaur bones with pliosaur tooth marks, fish in enormous quantities, other marine reptiles. In the Jurassic oceans where the largest pliosaurs thrived, there was nothing in the water that was definitively safe from them. They were the apex predators of their world, occupying the ecological role that nothing else has occupied since. Not even modern sperm whales or great white sharks, because pliosaurs combined the size of a great whale with the active hunting strategy of a large shark. How they hunted is something that can be inferred from their anatomy. The 4 large paddle limbs propelled them through the water in a flying motion, the same general locomotion as their long-necked relatives, but applied to a body designed for speed rather than precision. The short neck and large head meant a smaller moment arm between the center of mass and the jaw tips, which translates into faster, more powerful strikes. A pliosaur could accelerate toward prey and snap its jaws shut faster than a long-necked animal could maneuver its head. The short neck was not a design limitation but a design choice, or rather the result of natural selection favoring a configuration that could deliver those enormous jaws with maximum force and minimum warning. There is a quality to the pliosaur skull that is worth spending a moment with, because it speaks to something deeper about what these animals were. The skull, from above, is shaped something like a very long, narrow teardrop. The nostril openings are positioned toward the back of the skull rather than at the front, because in a fast-moving aquatic predator, nostril placement at the snout tip creates turbulence and impedes movement. The eye sockets are positioned midway along the skull, giving overlapping forward vision, which is the configuration associated with predators that judge distance. And the jaw margins, seen from the side, describe a gentle curve that closes with an interlocking fit, tooth against tooth, each tooth finding the gap between teeth on the opposite jaw and locking there. The nostrils of pliosaurs open into an olfactory passage that connects to the back of the mouth rather than to the throat, which means they almost certainly smelled water, tasted it, gathered chemical information about the environment the way modern sharks do with their chemoreception. A pliosaur moving through the Cretaceous ocean was reading the water constantly, finding the chemical traces of animals it could not yet see, following gradients of scent through the warm, complex sea toward prey that might be half a kilometer away. The pliosaurs of the early and middle Jurassic were the dominant apex predators of their world, but as the Cretaceous wore on and the seas changed, the pliosaurs gradually declined. The massive forms of the Jurassic, gave way to somewhat smaller Cretaceous descendants. The great ecological niche that Liopleurodon and its relatives had occupied began to be contested. By the late Cretaceous, the Pliosaurs were no longer the dominant ocean predators they had once been. Something had changed in the ocean, and something else had stepped in to claim the position they had held. That something was the Mosasaurs. But the Mosasaurs were still some chapters away in this story. Before they arrived, the Cretaceous ocean was a world in transition, with the Pliosaurs declining and the long-necked Plesiosaurs continuing their patient, ancient existence, and new players appearing on the edges of the ecosystem, testing the water, finding the empty spaces left by the Ichthyosaurs who had already gone. The Pliosaur sinks back toward the deeper water from which it came, moving with the particular heaviness of a very large body that has nonetheless mastered the medium it is in. The paddles work with slow power. The huge head tilts very slightly as it descends, and for just a moment you have a direct view of one of those eyes, set in the skull like a polished stone, very still, very clear. It passes below the level where the warm light reaches. And then it is gone, down into the darker water, going wherever large things go when they have finished checking the upper layers. You breathe slowly. The water around you is warm and very quiet. The Pliosaur is gone. But you can still feel the pressure its movement created, that gentle secondary wave that the passage of a large body always leaves in water. You remain still for a moment, floating in the ancient sea, aware of the different layers of life around you, above and below. The long-necked Plesiosaurs in the middle water, the giant fish near the surface, the sharks moving in their own circuits at depths you can only sense, and below all of that, in the darker reaches, the Pliosaur going about its enormous life. The water holds you, the light comes down in its amber columns, and from the direction you have not been watching, from the direction that has been outside your awareness while you were focused on the Plesiosaurs and the Pliosaur descending, there comes a movement in the water, not the long, smooth translation of a Plesiosaur, not the heavy, direct propulsion of a Pliosaur, something horizontal, something that moves with the specific quality of a very long body, undulating in a medium that offers it no resistance, something whose movement is, in its own way, even more unsettling than everything that came before. It is long. That is the first thing and the most immediate thing. Long in the way that a river is long, in the way that suggests the length has its own purpose. Beyond simply connecting one end to the other, the body moves in a slow, continuous undulation, not the side-to-side thrash of a confused animal, but the measured lateral sweep of something entirely at home in this medium, something that has learned to use the water's resistance rather than fight it. From the small, pointed head to the tip of the tail, which ends in an asymmetrical fin unlike any tail configuration you have seen on any animal in any ocean you know. The animal is perhaps 9 meters long, and this is not the largest of its kind. This is a mosasaur, and it is looking at you, not dramatically, not the way predators are depicted in films, with a sudden attention that freezes the prey, just a slight reorientation of the head, a turning of those dark, attentive eyes toward whatever has disturbed the water nearby. The tongue flickers, and there it is, the detail that no reconstruction fully captures until you know to look for it. The tongue is forked, not in the way you might have vaguely assumed if you thought about it at all, but fully forked, a distinct bifurcated organ that extends from the jaw and samples the water and is withdrawn. The same organ that a monitor lizard uses on land. The same organ that tells the animal through chemical information what has recently moved through this water and in which direction. Mosasaurs were related to monitor lizards and to snakes, which makes them, in a technical sense, distant relatives of those fork-tongued animals. This relationship was debated for years after their discovery, but is now well established in the scientific literature. The forked tongue in living lizards and snakes is used for sampling the environment, drawing molecules of scent or taste from the air or ground into a specialized organ in the roof of the mouth called the Jacobson's organ. There is strong anatomical evidence that mosasaurs possessed the same organ and the same general chemosensory system. They tasted the sea. They read the water the way you read a text, extracting information that guided them toward prey and away from danger. Mosasaurs came late to the Cretaceous ocean story. The earliest mosasaurs appear in the fossil record around 95 million years ago, just around the time when the Ichthyosaurs were making their final exit. Whether this was coincidence or something more causal is debated. Perhaps the disappearance of the Ichthyosaurs left ecological space that the early Mosasaurs moved into. Perhaps the Mosasaurs outcompeted the last Ichthyosaurs. Perhaps the two events were entirely unrelated, the Ichthyosaurs disappearing for reasons that had nothing to do with Mosasaurs, and the Mosasaurs arriving and diversifying into an ocean that happened to have recently lost one of its dominant groups. The timing is suggestive, but not conclusive. What happened after the Mosasaurs arrived is not debatable. They diversified at a pace that is extraordinary even by the standards of evolutionary biology. Within a few million years of their appearance in the fossil record, Mosasaurs had split into dozens of species distributed across every ocean on the planet. They ranged from modest animals of 3 or 4 meters to the giants of the late Cretaceous that approached and perhaps exceeded 15 meters. They occupied every major ecological role in the open ocean. Some were fish specialists. Some were mollusk crushers. Some were pursuit predators of other marine reptiles. And at the top of the hierarchy, the largest mosasaurs were apex predators of an order the ocean has not seen since. The tail of a mosasaur, that asymmetrical fin at the end of the long body, was one of the discoveries that changed how scientists understood these animals in the modern era. For a long time, mosasaurs were reconstructed with essentially lizard-like tails, long and tapering, without the distinct fin. But soft tissue impressions found in exceptional fossils in the 1990s and 2000s revealed that the tail of a mosasaur was not lizard-like at all. It was crescent-shaped, bifurcated, more like a shark's tail than a lizard's tail. The lower lobe of the tail fin was larger than the upper, the opposite of a shark, but the same configuration as certain fast-moving fish. This tail, combined with the undulating body motion, made mosasaurs significantly faster in the water than earlier reconstructions had suggested. The skull of a mosasaur is worth dwelling on because it represents one of the most elegant hunting tools the ocean has ever produced. The jaws are long and armed with teeth that in the different mosasaur species take different forms. In some species, the teeth are simple pointed cones, the kind that work for gripping slippery fish. In others, including the large Plesiosaurus, the teeth are more robust, designed for crushing. In at least one lineage, the teeth are arranged in 2 rows, a primary row and a secondary row of smaller replacement teeth positioned behind the main teeth like a backup system. This double row arrangement is reminiscent of shark dentition and serves the same function, ensuring that a lost tooth can be replaced without leaving a gap in the hunting apparatus. Plesiosaurus proriger is perhaps the most dramatic mosasaur of the western interior seaway, reaching lengths that estimates put at 12 to 15 meters. But what is unusual about Plesiosaurus, compared to most predatory animals of its size, is the front of its snout. There are no teeth at the very tip of the upper jaw. Instead, there is a bony projection, a rounded protrusion of solid bone that extends slightly beyond the jaw margin. What was this for? Paleontologists have proposed that it was used for ramming. Plesiosaurus may have used its blunt snout as a weapon, striking prey or rivals with the force of its enormous body behind it. Modern killer whales have been observed ramming prey, and the analogy may be apt. A 15-meter mosasaur moving at speed could deliver an impact with its reinforced snout that would stun or injure even large prey. One of the most important discoveries about mosasaur biology relates to how they reproduced. For many years, the assumption was that mosasaurs, like most reptiles, laid eggs. They would presumably come ashore, dig nests, lay their eggs, and return to the sea in the way that sea turtles do. This assumption was challenged by a fossil discovery in Kansas that described very small mosasaur skeletal remains found in open ocean deposits, not near shore. The size and context of these tiny specimens was consistent with recently born animals, not hatchlings from beach nests. Combined with anatomical evidence suggesting that mosasaurs had a flexible pelvic girdle more suitable for live birth than for egg-laying, the picture began to shift. The current scientific consensus is that mosasaurs gave birth to live young in the open ocean. They did not come to shore. They did not lay eggs. The mother mosasaur delivered her young directly into the sea, and the young were born swimming. This strategy, shared with the Ichthyosaurs and the Plesiosaurs that preceded the mosasaurs, makes sense for animals that had committed so completely to the aquatic world. Going ashore to lay eggs would require limbs capable of moving on land, and mosasaur limbs were paddles. They were too far gone into the ocean to go back even temporarily. There is also evidence that at least some mosasaurs may have been partially warm-blooded, maintaining body temperatures above that of the surrounding water through metabolic heat generation rather than purely through sunbathing. Analysis of oxygen isotopes preserved in mosasaur tooth enamel has suggested that the body temperatures of some species were elevated above ambient water temperature, especially in individuals that ranged into cooler, higher latitude waters. An animal that was metabolically warm would have been more active, more capable of sustained effort, and more able to inhabit the full range of ocean environments regardless of water temperature. It would have been, in some fundamental sense, closer to a mammal than to a cold-blooded lizard. The diversity of mosasaurs at the peak of their dominance, in the final 10 to 15 million years of the Cretaceous, is staggering when laid out in full. There was Ichthyosaurus, which may have grown to 15 meters. Mosasaurus hoffmanii itself, the animal that gave the group its name, a massive pursuit predator. Prognathodon, a crusher of ammonites and hard-shelled prey with blunt, rounded teeth in the back of the jaw. Plesiosaurus, a more modestly sized animal that appears from its skull anatomy to have had enhanced underwater hearing, possibly suggesting a strategy of hunting by sound in murky or dark water. Globidans, with ball-like teeth obviously designed for crushing. Clidasts, one of the smallest common mosasaurs, fast and agile where its larger relatives were powerful and direct. Each of these animals occupied a different position in the mosasaur ecological guild. Collectively, they covered the full range of hunting strategies available to large predators in the warm, shallow seas of the late Cretaceous. They were not competitors so much as colleagues, each exploiting a different resource, each using a slightly different version of the basic mosasaur body plan in a slightly different way. The mosasaur that has been watching you all this time makes a slow turn, and you see the full length of it against the amber-green water. Long, patient, already moving on to something else, something in the middle distance that you cannot see but that the animal's forked tongue is reading in the chemistry of the water. It moves without hurry, with the confidence of something that has no reason to hurry, and as it goes it becomes simply a shape, and then a suggestion of a shape, and then just a disturbance in the water that smooths itself out and is gone. The last masters of the Cretaceous Sea. That is what they were, and that is what the fossil record shows. From 95 million years ago to 66 million years ago, the mosasaurs ruled. Their fossils are found in chalk formations in Belgium and Kansas and Morocco and New Zealand. They are the most common large vertebrate fossils from the late Cretaceous seafloor. They were everywhere. They were dominant in a way that few animal groups have ever been dominant in the open ocean. And they were extraordinary. The ocean will not see their like again. The ocean is never still. You understand this now, drifting in the warm green water of the Cretaceous Sea, watching the different levels of life above and below you. At the surface, the light plays and shifts. In the middle water, the shapes of large animals move in their separate orbits. Below that, in the dimmer layers, other presences that you can sense more than see. Every animal in this sea is either hunting or being hunted, and most of them are both simultaneously, predators in relation to one thing and potential prey in relation to something else. The art of survival in this ocean is not simply the art of finding food. It is the art of finding food without becoming food in the process. The hunting strategies of the great Cretaceous sea reptiles were as varied as the animals themselves, and understanding them requires understanding something about how the ocean is organized. The ocean is not a flat space. It is a vertical world, layered by temperature and light and chemistry, and different layers offer different resources and different dangers. An animal that specializes in the sunlit surface zone needs different tools than one that hunts in the dimmer middle water, and both of them need different tools from an animal that can reach the deep, cold layers where almost nothing lives. The Cretaceous sea reptiles between them covered all of these zones. Near the surface, the primary hunters of fish and squid were the Ichthyosaurs in the earlier periods, and, later, the faster mosasaurs. These were pursuit predators, animals that chased their prey through open water and caught it through a combination of speed and endurance. The ichthyosaur body plan, those streamlined forms that we discussed earlier, was built for exactly this strategy. Acceleration, sustained speed, the ability to follow a fast-moving fish through a change of direction without losing the advantage. We can infer this from anatomy. The tail flukes, the streamlined body, the large eyes for tracking fast prey in good light. All of it says chase. All of it says speed is the primary tool. Among the mosasaurs, the evidence for coordinated hunting is intriguing and not fully settled. The species, Platecarpus tympaniticus, is of particular interest to researchers who study mosasaur behavior. The skull of Platecarpus is somewhat different from its relatives, with an unusually well-developed inner ear structure that suggests enhanced underwater hearing. This is the kind of sensory enhancement associated in modern animals with underwater acoustic communication. Dolphins use underwater sound to coordinate their hunting. Killer whales use it to maintain contact with group members during cooperative hunts. If Platecarpus communicated acoustically, it raises the possibility that some mosasaurs hunted in coordinated groups rather than as solitary individuals, driving schools of fish, the way modern orcas drive salmon or herring. The long-necked Plesiosaurs presented a different hunting profile entirely. Their necks were instruments of precision rather than power, allowing them to reach into small spaces and among the debris of the water column for prey that a larger, less dexterous predator would have missed. The teeth of most elasmosaurids are needle-like and interlocking, designed to cage small prey rather than to grip or crush. The prey, almost certainly, was predominantly small fish. Squid, belemnites, the ancient squid relatives that were extremely common in Cretaceous seas. The long-necked plesiosaurs were likely not hunting things their own size. They were hunting the middle levels of the food chain, the abundant, diverse animals that occupied the water column in vast numbers. The Pliosaurs hunted at the other extreme, where the long-necked plesiosaurs were precision instruments operating on small prey. The large pliosaurs were blunt instruments operating on large prey. Everything about pliosaur anatomy speaks to this. The massive skull, the large conical teeth, the powerful paddles. A pliosaur hunting a long-necked plesiosaur would not attempt the sustained pursuit strategy of a fast open-water predator. It would use its speed and its enormous bite to close the distance quickly and strike decisively. One bite, or a very few bites. The large teeth of Kronosaurus could penetrate bone, and there are fossil plesiosaur bones that show exactly the kind of puncture marks that those teeth would leave. There is a famous fossil from Belgium that captures a moment in the food chain with a specificity that is almost unbelievable. A mosasaur skeleton was found with, preserved in its abdominal region, the remains of a large bony fish. Inside that fish, still preserved, were the remains of a smaller fish that the large fish had eaten shortly before being eaten itself. 3 animals in sequence, each the prey of the last, all preserved together in a single fossil block. What was a moment of ordinary Cretaceous ecology? Something that happened countless times every day in that warm sea became instead a moment frozen in stone that tells us, with remarkable precision, how the food chain operated. The sharks of the Cretaceous Sea occupied their own position in the hunting hierarchy, somewhat parallel to the mosasaurs but using different sensory systems and different body mechanics. Cretoxorhina mantelli, the Ginsu shark, was a large and common predator in the western interior seaway. The name Ginsu shark was applied informally by researchers because the teeth of Cretoxorhina are smooth and pointed in a way that would have made it an extraordinarily efficient cutter. Fossilized mosasaur vertebrae have been found with Cretoxorhina tooth marks on them, which tells us that even the large sea reptiles were not immune to shark attacks. Whether these represent successful predation on living mosasaurs or scavenging on dead ones is difficult to determine from the fossil evidence alone, but the teeth marks exist. The ammonites, those coiled cephalopods that were so abundant in the Cretaceous Sea, occupied a fascinating ecological position. Large ammonites may have been prey for mosasaurs with crushing ability such as prognathodon, but the ammonites were themselves active predators of smaller animals, using their tentacles to capture soft-bodied prey and their beaks to process it. They were also, certainly, prey for the Ichthyosaurs of the Jurassic and early Cretaceous, and their heavily coiled shells suggest that at least some species had evolved their architecture partially as defense against predation. The arms race between predators and prey, that endlessly cycling evolutionary competition, was as active in the Cretaceous Sea as it is in any modern ecosystem. Belemnites deserve a mention here because they were, in terms of sheer abundance, among the most important animals in the Cretaceous food web. Belemnites were squid-like cephalopods, with an internal shell shaped something like a bullet, and these shells are preserved in enormous numbers in Cretaceous marine sediments. Everywhere there were Cretaceous seas, there were belemnites. They were probably the primary prey of many ichthyosaurs, many long-necked plesiosaurs, and certainly of many sharks and large bony fish. When paleontologists find fossil assemblages from the Cretaceous Sea, belemnite guards, those small bullet-shaped internal shells are often the most common element. They were the krill of the Cretaceous, the small, abundant thing that made everything else possible. The hunting behavior of the various Cretaceous sea reptiles was shaped not only by their body plans and their senses, but by the particular ecology of the ocean they inhabited. The western interior seaway, with its relatively shallow depth and abundant light penetrating to the bottom in the shallowest areas, was a different hunting ground from the open Pacific or the deep Tethys Sea. Animals adapted for the seaway had different strategies from animals adapted for the open ocean. The seaway was a more enclosed space, with coastlines not far away in any direction, with river inputs bringing nutrients from the land, with seasonal variation in temperature and salinity that open ocean does not experience. At the very top of the food chain in the late Cretaceous Sea, the largest mosasaurs occupied the position that we associate with large sperm whales or great white sharks in the modern ocean, except with a greater range of prey options. A 12 to 15 meter mosasaur could eat large fish. Smaller mosasaurs, plesiosaurs of various sizes, marine turtles, large ammonites, birds, and anything else that entered the water. The versatility of the mosasaur feeding apparatus, with its flexible jaw that could open to extraordinary width, meant that prey selection was limited mainly by what the animal could physically fit in its mouth, and for the largest mosasaurs, that was a considerable range of options. There is something about this that is worth sitting with for a moment. The Cretaceous ocean was not a place of individual drama. It was a place of continuous process. Animals hunted, and were hunted every day, every hour, in every quarter of the warm, shallow sea. Death was constant and unremarkable. The mosasaur that ate the fish, that ate the smaller fish, was doing what mosasaurs did. The shark that left tooth marks on a mosasaur vertebra was doing what sharks did. The plesiosaur that swept its long neck through a school of belemnites was doing what plesiosaurs did. Each of these events was unremarkable in itself. It is only from the distance of 66 million years that they become remarkable, preserved in stone, readable by the patient work of paleontology. The water is warm and the light is amber gold, and you drift in the middle of all of this activity, this continuous feeding that is the ocean's fundamental business. Animals move past you at the different levels of the water column. Each one is engaged in its particular version of the same fundamental task. Find energy in a form you can use, and use it, and find more. The Cretaceous Sea provided that energy in abundance. The ocean was full, in every sense of the word, and everything in it was involved, at every moment, in the process of converting that abundance from one form to another. The hunting will continue through the night, through the season, through the millions of years of the Cretaceous. You watch it with the calm that comes from distance, from knowing that all of this is very far in the past, that the animals moving through this warm water are images from a record carved in stone rather than immediate presences. The hunting is not frightening from here. It is simply what was, what always was, in this ocean, from its first warm current to its last. Let the warm water hold you. Let the ancient hunting go on around you in its unhurried way. The Cretaceous ocean provides for everything in it, and right now it is providing for you too, in the form of this gentle story, this warm immersion in a world where everything is in its place and everything is doing what it was made to do. Rest here for a moment, before the next layer of this world reveals itself. You have come a long way into this ocean. If this story has been good company for your sleep, a like and a subscription mean more than you might think. They help this kind of quiet storytelling find the people who need it. Now, the water is getting deeper. Let us continue. You are moving now, if you allow your imagination to guide you, from the open ocean toward the interior of a continent that will one day be North America. But there is no interior to reach, not in the way you know it. The continent has been cut. An ocean came in and divided it neatly from north to south, so that what you are swimming into is not the heart of a landmass, but the middle of a sea, the Western Interior Seaway. That great shallow arm of ocean that divided North America for much of the Cretaceous period extends around you in every direction. The light here is different from the open ocean. Shallower water means more light reaching the bottom, and near the coasts, the bottom is close enough that you can see the soft, pale sediment below you, the ripple marks where currents have moved through, the occasional dark shape of something resting on the surface of the mud. The water has a slightly different quality here, a hint of the rivers that empty into it from the continents on either side. Those rivers carry sediment and nutrients, and where nutrients enter the sea, life responds. The seaway, despite its shallowness, or perhaps because of it, was enormously productive. The seaway at its widest was roughly 900 miles across. At its longest, it ran from northern Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, but at its deepest point, it was only approximately 800 feet below the surface. In most places, it was considerably shallower. This shallowness had consequences that shaped every living thing in it. Shallow water is warm water, and warm water is productive water. And in the seaway, the warmth and productivity combined to create an ecosystem that was unlike anything that exists in the modern world. The closest modern analogue to the Western Interior Seaway might be the Caribbean Sea, or perhaps the Gulf of Mexico, but neither of these quite captures what the seaway was. The Caribbean is deeper. The Gulf of Mexico is more enclosed. The seaway was a channel, north to south, with the warm equatorial currents flowing north through it and the cooler northern waters flowing south, creating a gentle circulation that mixed nutrients and brought oxygenated water to all its depths. The seaway had its own distinct ecology, different from the open Pacific on one side and the open Atlantic on the other, because its particular combination of size, depth, and connectivity produced conditions found nowhere else. The animals that lived specifically in the seaway have been studied intensely because the chalk deposits of Kansas and Nebraska and South Dakota and other American mid-continent states have produced exceptional fossils. These chalk formations, known collectively as the Niobrara Formation, are the remains of the seaway floor, compressed and lithified over millions of years. Drilling into these formations is like reading a letter from the seaway's past. Every centimeter of chalk represents a period of time when tiny organisms lived and died in the warm water above, and their shells drifted down and settled and accumulated. The fossils embedded in the chalk are the larger things that lived above, preserved in the same slow accumulation. The Niobrara Formation has given paleontology some of its most famous specimens. Elasmosaurus was found in Kansas. Plesiosaurus was found in Kansas. Pteranodons, the large flying reptiles whose wingspans reached 8 or 9 meters, are known from Kansas. The diving bird Hesperornis, which we will discuss in the next chapter, is known primarily from the Niobrara, and countless fish, sharks, mosasaurs, turtles, and smaller creatures have been recovered from these formations over the century and a half since they were first studied. The turtles of the Western Interior Seaway deserve particular attention because they represent one of the stranger and less commonly discussed aspects of this ecosystem. Archelon iscaros, the largest turtle ever known, swam through these waters. To see Archelon in life would be a startling experience. The shell measured approximately 4.5 meters from front to back, and perhaps 2.5 meters across, roughly the dimensions of a large sports utility vehicle. The paddles were long and flexible, rather than the stiff, heavy flippers of modern sea turtles. The head was relatively small, with a hooked beak that appears in some specimens to have been powerful enough to crush soft prey. What did Archelon eat? The hooked beak suggests something that required piercing rather than crushing. Jellyfish and other soft-bodied prey are a likely component of the diet. Some researchers have proposed that Archelon also fed on soft ammonites, picking the animal from its shell with its narrow beak. The stomach region of known specimens has not preserved clear contents, so the diet remains somewhat speculative, but the anatomy suggests a generalist approach to feeding, targeting whatever was abundant and manageable given the equipment available. Alongside Archelon swam Protostega, that strange turtle with no complete shell, and other sea turtles of various sizes. The turtle lineage had been present in the sea since before the Cretaceous, and the seaway provided an ideal environment for them. Warm water, abundant soft-bodied prey, relatively safe from the deep-diving mosasaurs in the shallower areas near the coasts. But not entirely safe. Mosasaur fossils have been found with turtle shell fragments in their gut regions, which tells us that some mosasaurs, at least, were capable of handling the defense that the shell provided. The fish of the seaway were no less remarkable for being less famous. Shiphactinus, that giant predatory fish that could reach 6 meters in length, was a common predator in the shallower areas. Its fossils appear repeatedly in the Niobrara, always dramatic in their completeness, always giving the impression of an animal designed entirely around the act of chasing and swallowing other fish. There were also large sharks, relatives of Cretoxyrhina, moving through the seaway with the patience that sharks have always had, finding food in the way that sharks find food, through chemical sensing and the detection of disturbances in the water. The seaway also had its stranger inhabitants, creatures that do not fit neatly into the categories of fish or reptile or any other group you might easily name. Encodus was a fish with large, forward-pointing fangs that appeared disproportionately large for its body, giving it the slightly alarming appearance of a small animal trying to be a terrifying one. It was abundant. Fossils of Encodus are found throughout the Niobrara, often in large numbers, suggesting that it was one of the primary prey fish for the larger predators of the seaway. Countless Encodus were eaten by Shiphactinus, by mosasaurs, by sharks, by diving birds. It occupied the same ecological position in the seaway's food chain that sardines or herring occupy in modern seas. The coastlines of the seaway, those places where the water became very shallow and met the low-lying land on either side, were inhabited by a different community from the open water. There, in the tidal zones and the river mouths, crocodilians moved through the shallow water. These were the ancestors of modern crocodiles, though they were different enough from their modern descendants to be classified separately. Some were small, marsh-dwelling animals that fed on fish and small invertebrates. Others were larger, more aggressive, capable of venturing into the open seaway for periods before returning to the shallower, safer waters near the coast. The river systems that fed the seaway from both sides carried with them the materials of the land. Tree trunks, swept from Cretaceous forests by floods, occasionally floated out into the seaway and sank slowly, their wood becoming habitat for boring organisms and eventually joining the sediment on the bottom. Seeds and plant material from the continents on either side drifted into the warm water and died, contributing to the organic richness of the sediment. Even land animals occasionally ended up in the seaway, swept out to sea by floods or dying near the coast and drifting into the water, and their remains were occasionally incorporated into the fossil record alongside the purely marine organisms. You drift through this shallow sea in your imagination, close enough to see the bottom in some places. The soft, pale mud with its traces of activity. A turtle passes below you at a depth of perhaps 20 feet, moving with the deliberate paddle stroke that all sea turtles use, heading toward a shallower area where the water grows warm enough to be opaque with algae. A school of Encodus scatters and reforms as something larger passes through them, and then they are gone, replaced by the flicker of their silver bodies catching the light as they move away. The seaway was its own world within the larger world of the Cretaceous ocean, distinct in its character and its ecology, but connected to the broader ocean at both its northern and southern ends. Animals moved in and out of it. The warm currents from the south brought tropical fauna northward. The cooler currents from the north carried nutrients southward, and on both sides of it, the land was full of its own extraordinary life, including the large predatory dinosaurs that rule the popular imagination of this period, that were in their own way just as magnificent as the creatures of the sea. The land is close. In the seaway, you could swim to the coast in a matter of hours if you chose, and there, on the shore, where the warm water meets the low, flat ground of the late Cretaceous continent, you might catch a glimpse of something on 4 legs or 2, something that has nothing to do with the ocean, something from the other half of this ancient world. But you are in the water. The seaway holds you, warm and full, and the story is not yet ready to move ashore. There are more things in this sea to meet, and the next one comes from above. Something crosses the light above you, a shadow on the surface of the water, a shape that for a moment blocks the amber columns of sunlight filtering down, and then is gone. You look up through the water toward the air above the sea, and you catch, for just a moment, the impression of something very large passing overhead. Not a cloud, not a disturbance in the water. Something in the air, moving with the particular effortless purposefulness of things that fly. The Cretaceous ocean did not exist only below the surface. It had a layer above the water too, a layer occupied by creatures that were born into the air and lived there, and that came to the sea only when they needed to eat. The pterosaurs were not dinosaurs, in the technical sense. They were archosaurs, members of the same broad group that produced the dinosaurs, but they were their own separate lineage with their own evolutionary history. They had been flying since the late Triassic period, hundreds of millions of years before the Cretaceous. And by the time the seaway was full and the mosasaurs were at their peak, the pterosaurs had diversified into an enormous range of forms. Some were small, insect-eating animals no larger than a sparrow. Some were among the largest flying animals that have ever lived. Pteranodon is the pterosaur most associated with the western interior seaway, and for good reason. Its fossils are abundant in the Niobrara Formation, meaning it was a regular presence above the seaway's warm waters. Pteranodon reached wingspans of 7 to 9 meters, roughly the dimensions of a small plane, and its skull was dominated by a large bony crest that extended backward from the head. The crest may have served multiple functions, as a rudder for steering in flight, as a counterbalance for the long, toothless beak, and possibly as a display structure for recognition or mate attraction. The beak of Pteranodon was long and toothless, unlike many earlier pterosaurs that possessed teeth for gripping prey. A long, smooth, pointy beak is the tool of an animal that hunts by surface plunging, skimming the water surface and snatching up fish with a quick dip of the beak, the way modern gannets or terns hunt. Pteranodon almost certainly fed this way, gliding low over the seaway on its enormous wings, watching the surface below for the flash of fish near the water's edge. And then that brief, precise dip that brought the beak into contact with the water and a fish out of it. How did a creature with a 9-meter wingspan land on the water, if it needed to? This is a question that has been considered by researchers, and the answer, based on biomechanical modeling, appears to be that Pteranodon could indeed land on the water and take off from it, using its wings somewhat like a cormorant or an albatross, spreading them to slow the descent and then pushing off the surface of the water in a kind of running launch. This would have allowed it to rest on the surface of the seaway during long foraging flights, which were probably necessary given the distances it would have needed to cover to find concentrations of fish. But there is something even stranger in the skies above the seaway, something that most people are not aware of when they think about the Cretaceous ocean. Ichthyosaurus, another pterosaur found in the Niobrara, had a crest so extravagant that when the first well-preserved specimens were described, some researchers initially doubted that the crest was real. The crest of Ichthyosaurus, at least in some specimens, was shaped like an enormous antler, branching and multi-pronged, rising from the back of the skull to a height that exceeded the length of the animal's body. It was the most disproportionate cranial ornament in the history of vertebrate life. What it was for is still genuinely uncertain. Display seems likely. Navigation, using the crest as a kind of sail, has been proposed. Whatever its function, it was real, and it was present above the seaway millions of years ago. And then there were the birds, real birds, more recognizable than most things you have encountered in this ancient ocean. Though not quite recognizable in the way you might expect. Hesperornis regalis was a bird that lived in the western interior seaway, and it was large, roughly the size of a modern emperor penguin, perhaps 1.5 meters in length. But unlike the pterosaurs above and the reptiles below, Hesperornis was a genuine bird in the full technical sense, with feathers and bird bones and bird metabolic rates, and it was completely, irrevocably flightless. Hesperornis could not fly. Its wings were reduced to tiny vestigial remnants, completely non-functional as flying structures. Instead, everything that might have gone into wings went into legs, and feet that were powerful swimming organs. The legs of Hesperornis were positioned far back on its body, almost at the tail, the same configuration used by modern loons and grebes, which gives excellent underwater propulsion but makes walking on land extremely awkward. Hesperornis probably came ashore only to nest, struggling across beaches on legs placed all wrong for walking, and spent the vast majority of its life in the water. What makes Hesperornis unlike any modern bird is its teeth. It had them, real, functional teeth in both jaws, small and recurved, designed for holding slippery fish. Modern birds have no teeth, a condition that evolved after the Cretaceous period. In the late Cretaceous, toothed birds like Hesperornis were a normal feature of the marine environment. There were other toothed birds too, smaller flying species like Ichthyosaurus, which looked somewhat like a large tern but with teeth visible if you looked closely at its beak. The Cretaceous sky and sea were inhabited by birds that had not yet completed the evolutionary journey away from their toothed ancestors. The relationship between the flying and diving animals above the seaway and the great reptiles below was one of mutual indifference most of the time, with occasional violent intersection. Mosasaurs and large fish were surely capable of taking Hesperornis if they could catch one near the surface. The large toothed jaws of Plesiosaurus could certainly have accommodated a bird-sized animal, and there is indirect fossil evidence suggesting that at least some sea reptiles took diving birds opportunistically when they encountered them near the surface. But Hesperornis was not an easy target. It was a strong swimmer and an agile diver, capable of reaching depths to pursue fish, and it had the diving reflex and physiological adaptations of a genuinely aquatic bird rather than a terrestrial bird that occasionally got wet. The pteranodons above were safer. At 9 meters of wingspan, gliding at height over the seaway, they were essentially beyond the reach of anything in the water. A mosasaur could leap from the water, and some paleontologists have speculated that large mosasaurs occasionally did take pterosaurs that landed on the surface. But Pteranodon was large enough to be a difficult target, and probably spent as little time on the water surface as possible, gliding in, snatching its fish, and returning to the air in a single smooth motion. The ecological interaction between the aerial hunters and the marine hunters divided the seaway's resources in an interesting way. The pterosaurs took the fish near the surface, the ones that came close enough to the light to be vulnerable from above. The mosasaurs and large fish took prey at various depths below. The diving birds like Hesperornis operated in the transition zone, entering the water from above and pursuing prey to moderate depths. Between all of these groups, the fish and squid and belemnites of the seaway were being systematically harvested from every direction and every depth. It was an extraordinarily efficient ecosystem, with almost no layer of the water column left unexploited. There is something worth imagining about the surface of the western interior seaway during the late Cretaceous afternoon. Pteranodons banking in the warm air above, catching thermals off the warm water below, their enormous wings catching the late sun. Hesperornis riding on the surface, head tilted to watch below for fish, occasionally disappearing beneath the water in a smooth, practiced dive. Below the surface, the shapes of large things moving, the surface itself disturbed by fish coming up to feed on the abundant plankton in the well-lit surface layer. And in the sky further off, the sharp V shape of Ichthyosaurus with its impossible crest, moving from one feeding area to another on some internal navigation that we cannot reconstruct. The seaway was alive in every dimension, below the surface and above it, in the water and in the air. The Cretaceous world did not divide neatly into sea and sky. It was a continuous fabric of life, with different threads running through different levels, and the threads touching and intersecting at the surface of the water where the two realms met. You float in the warm seaway and let the afternoon settle around you. Above, through the bright membrane of the water's surface, you can see the shapes of pterosaurs. Below, at the edge of your visibility, the larger shapes of the sea reptiles continue their patient circuits, and around you, at your level, the fish move in their schools, the belemnites spin slowly, the ancient sea turtle paddles past on its enormous paddles, unhurried. Everything is in its place. Everything is doing what it was made to do. The seaway holds it all, warm and patient and full, and the light falls through the water in those long amber columns. Slower as the sun moves toward the horizon, the color shifting from gold to something amber-orange, the color of afternoon ending in a world where afternoon has been ending for millions of years and will continue ending for millions more. Rest in this moment. The light is changing, and the next chapter of this story is in the darker water below. Below you, the light runs out. It does not end abruptly. There is no clean line where brightness stops and darkness begins. Instead, it fades. The amber gold of the surface water, where sunlight filters through clearly and gives everything a warm golden cast, slowly transitions through green, and then deeper green, and then a blue-green that is like looking through very dark glass. And then below that, a blue that is almost grey, and below that, a grey that is almost black. The light does not stop, but it diminishes until it is no longer enough for eyes that need it. The Cretaceous Ocean, warm as it was at the surface, had its depths. The western interior seaway was shallow enough that the darkness was only a few 100 feet below you, but the open ocean beyond the seaway went down to the same abyssal depths that modern oceans reach. Thousands of feet, places where the pressure is immense, and the temperature is cold, regardless of what is happening at the surface far above. These deep zones were the unknown country of the Cretaceous Sea, and they remain, in many ways, the unknown country of paleontology. The deep ocean is a poor environment for fossil preservation. The conditions that create fossils require rapid burial in sediment, and the deep ocean floor, covered in fine ooze, does not move quickly. Organic material sinking from the surface decomposes in the deep water before it reaches the floor, or is consumed by the sparse but real life that exists in the deep. What reaches the bottom is often very little, and what is buried in deep-sea sediment is rarely accessible to fossil hunters, who depend on geological uplift and erosion to bring ancient seabed up to the surface where it can be studied. What this means is that our picture of the deep Cretaceous Ocean is necessarily incomplete. We know what lived near the surface and in the shallow seas because those environments preserved fossils well. We know much less about what lived in the deep water because the deep water preserved almost nothing. But we can reason from what we know. The deep ocean today is full of life, even if it is life of a strange and different character from the sunlit zones above. The deep ocean of the Cretaceous, warmer and more chemically active than today's, was probably also full of life, and some of it was certainly large. The Ichthyosaurs, as we discussed earlier, appear to have been capable of deep dives, reaching depths of 1,500 feet or more in pursuit of prey. What were they finding at those depths? The most likely prey was squid, or belemnites, the ancient squid relatives that were enormously abundant throughout the Cretaceous Sea. Modern sperm whales dive to similar depths to hunt squid, and the parallel with deep-diving ichthyosaurs is compelling. Squid in the deep ocean are often larger than their shallow water relatives, a phenomenon known as deep-sea gigantism that occurs in several animal groups. The deep-water belemnites of the Cretaceous may have been substantial animals. The oceanic anoxic events of the Cretaceous deserve more attention here, because they represent one of the most dramatic features of the deep Cretaceous Ocean and one that is not widely known. Several times during the Cretaceous period, the deep ocean experienced episodes of severe oxygen depletion. These were not small or local events. They were global, lasting millions of years, driven by a combination of increased volcanic activity, high temperatures, and altered ocean circulation. During these events, the deep water below certain depths became essentially devoid of oxygen, a condition called euxinia. In eusinic water, the normal processes of deep-sea decomposition break down. Without oxygen, the aerobic bacteria that would normally decompose organic matter cannot function. Instead, anaerobic bacteria take over, and they produce hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. In extreme cases, the hydrogen sulfide can build up in deep ocean water to levels that are toxic. Upwelling of this deep water could carry the toxic conditions upward into the habitable zones, creating episodes of widespread mortality in the shallower regions too. The black organic-rich sediments called black shales, found worldwide in Cretaceous marine formations, are the preserved record of these anoxic events. In places where the water column was anoxic, organic material that sank to the bottom was not decomposed by aerobic organisms because there were none. Instead, it was slowly buried intact. The result is these extraordinary black sedimentary layers, dense with organic carbon, preserved because the normal processes of decomposition were suspended. The same conditions that allowed this organic matter to accumulate also killed the animals that normally would have eaten it. For the large sea reptiles that lived in the Cretaceous Ocean, the anoxic zones were barriers. A mosasaur cannot breathe water, regardless of the oxygen content. It breathes air, surfacing regularly. But the prey that a mosasaur depended on could be affected by anoxic events. Fish that lived in middle-depth zones might have their habitat compressed by anoxia below and heat stress above. This would have been a stress on the food chains that the large predators relied on, though the exact effects on specific species in specific places are difficult to reconstruct from the fossil record. What the deep Cretaceous ocean held in the way of large animals is something we can only partially infer. We know that some mosasaurs appear to have been capable of deeper dives than others, based on bone structure and the presence of certain physiological adaptations. Platecarpus, with its enhanced hearing, may have been a mid-depth hunter that used acoustic information to hunt in conditions where vision was limited. The large Pliosaurs, with their powerful paddle propulsion, were certainly capable of sustained swimming at depth, but the fossil record from truly deep water simply does not exist in sufficient quantity to tell us what these animals found when they went down. There is something appropriate about this gap in the record. The deep ocean has always been the part of the sea that resists full understanding, the part that yields its information slowly and incompletely. Modern deep-sea research, with its remotely operated vehicles and deep sampling systems, is only beginning to reveal the extent and diversity of deep-sea life. The Cretaceous deep sea is, in this sense, doubly unknown. Unknown in the way that all of the past is unknown, and unknown in the additional way that deep ocean is unknown. But there are hints, there are fragments. A few remarkable fossils from deep water sediments that were later uplifted by tectonic forces give glimpses of what was present in the deeper water column. Large teeth, isolated vertebrae from animals whose size can only be estimated. Bite marks on prey bones that suggest very large predators operating in conditions where direct observation was impossible. The deep ocean was not empty. It was inhabited by things we are still in the process of understanding. The darkness below you is not threatening here, in this warm Cretaceous sea where you are drifting. It is simply deep, simply the part of the ocean that the light has not reached, that has its own ecology and its own logic, different from the sunlit zones above, but no less real. The shapes that move in that darkness are part of the same world you have been exploring. They are simply the part of it that is harder to see. Your eyes adjust as you drift, catching what little light remains at this depth. Far below, at the very edge of visibility, something moves. It is large, too large to fully make out at this distance, too far into the dimness to resolve into a clear shape. It moves horizontally, with a slow, powerful undulation that you feel more than see as a subtle pressure change in the water around you, and then it is gone, deeper still, below even the threshold of the faintest light. You breathe slowly and let the darkness hold you for a moment. The way deep water always holds things, without judgment, without preference. The Cretaceous ocean is deep and warm and full, and some of what fills it is beyond the reach of the light and beyond the reach of what we have yet found in the fossil record. The unknown is part of the story too. The things we cannot see are real, even in their invisibility. Let the warmth of the upper water call you back. Let the amber light ahead draw you upward. Out of the dimness, back into the familiar green gold of the seaway's sunlit layers. The darkness below will always be there, patient and full. But the story continues in the light, where the known things move in their ancient patterns, and where the next chapter of the Cretaceous Sea is already beginning. Time passes differently in the ocean than it does on land. The sea does not mark seasons the way a forest does not show the obvious cycle of growth and dormancy that a field or a prairie shows. The ocean's changes are subtler, more gradual, working over longer periods and showing their effects in the chemistry of the water and the distribution of species rather than in the color of leaves or the arrival of frost. But the ocean does change. The Cretaceous ocean changed. And the change, when it came, was felt first in the deep water and then slowly, irresistibly, at the surface. We are now moving in time, as well as space, forward through the Cretaceous, toward its end, the period we have been inhabiting for most of this story. The peak of the Cretaceous, between 90 and 70 million years ago, was the height of the warm ancient sea. Everything was in its fullest expression then. The Mosasaurs at the height of their diversity, the Plesiosaurs distributed across every ocean, the seaway full and productive. But nothing stays at its height forever. And the late Cretaceous, the final 10 to 15 million years before the end, was a period of gradual change. The sea level was dropping. Very slowly, imperceptibly from year to year, barely perceptibly from decade to decade. But the geological record shows it clearly. The Cretaceous Sea was retreating from its maximum extent. The Western Interior Seaway, which had been at its widest and most productive during the period from about 85 to 75 million years ago, was beginning to narrow as sea levels fell and the land on either side slowly rose. The coastlines were moving. The shallow areas of the seaway, which had been the most productive, were shrinking. This had consequences for the animals that depended on those shallow, productive waters. Fish that bred in the shallows found their breeding grounds diminishing. Invertebrate communities that anchored themselves in the soft sediment of specific areas were disrupted by the changing waterline. The intricate ecological web that had been built up over millions of years in the seaway was under pressure, not from a sudden catastrophe, but from the slow, relentless grinding of geography changing. At the same time, something was happening underground, far from the ocean, that would eventually affect everything. In what is now India, a massive volcanic system called the Deccan Traps was beginning to stir. Flood basalt eruptions, the same kind of enormous lava outpourings that have punctuated Earth's history at intervals, were beginning to produce lava in quantities that built up kilometre-thick stacks of rock across a large portion of the Indian subcontinent. This volcanism had started before the end of the Cretaceous and was ramping up as the period drew toward its conclusion. The Deccan eruptions released carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere in quantities large enough to affect global climate. Temperatures, which had been high throughout the Cretaceous, began to fluctuate in ways that the Cretaceous had not previously experienced. Some intervals became warmer due to the greenhouse effect of volcanic CO2. Others became briefly cooler as volcanic aerosols reflected sunlight. The climate of the late Cretaceous was becoming less stable than it had been at the period's height, and the ocean responded to each climate fluctuation with its own adjustments of temperature and chemistry. The fossil record from the last 10 million years of the Cretaceous shows signs of this stress in the marine fauna. The diversity of ammonites, those coiled cephalopods that had been a constant presence throughout the Mesozoic seas, begins to decline before the very end of the Cretaceous. The number of species drops, the geographic range of many species contracts. This is not the sudden cliff edge of an extinction event. This is the slow reduction of diversity that happens when an ecosystem is under sustained pressure. When the conditions that supported a wide range of species are gradually becoming less favorable. The mosasaurs appear to have remained robust through this period. The late Cretaceous mosasaur fauna is well documented and shows no obvious decline in diversity right up until the final moments of the period. Pliosaurus, Mosasaurus, and their relatives were still common in the fossil record from the last few million years of the Cretaceous, still clearly abundant and diverse in their warm seas. Whatever was affecting the ammonites and some of the invertebrate fauna had not yet reached the mosasaurs in any visible way, but the sea level continued to fall. The Western Interior Seaway, by the very end of the Cretaceous, was dramatically reduced from its maximum extent. Some portions had already dried up or become isolated lakes, cut off from the main seaway by the rising land on either side. The rich, shallow, productive waters that had been the center of the seaway's ecology for millions of years were dwindling, replaced by either open land or marginal coastal environments that were not the same thing as the seaway had been. The long-necked Plesiosaurs persisted. They were in some sense the most ancient of the great sea reptile lineages, with a family history that reached back into the Triassic. They had outlasted the Ichthyosaurs and outlasted countless climate fluctuations and ecological changes. The elasmosaurids of the late Cretaceous, animals like Elasmosaurus and Styxosaurus, were closely related to their distant Jurassic ancestors in terms of basic body plan. Even if the specific species were different, there is something almost moving about this persistence. In a world that was changing, that had always changed, the long-necked Plesiosaurs continued to trace their slow arcs through the warm water, sweeping their impossible necks through the schools of fish, unchanged in their fundamental strategy for 70 million years. The climate fluctuations of the late Cretaceous left their mark in the geological record in ways that are still being studied. Some layers show evidence of brief cooling episodes, periods when global temperatures dropped several degrees before recovering. Others show evidence of brief warming pulses driven by volcanic carbon dioxide. Each of these fluctuations would have affected the distribution and abundance of the organisms at the base of the food chain, the plankton, and the small invertebrates whose populations drove everything above them. And each fluctuation, even if brief in geological terms, would have been experienced by individual organisms as a real and stressful change in their environment. The pterosaurs above the sea continued their long evolutionary experiment in flight. By the very end of the Cretaceous, some pterosaurs had reached sizes that are difficult to believe even with fossil evidence in hand. Quetzalcoatlus northropi, known from Texas just below the very top of the Cretaceous fossil record, had a wingspan estimated at 10 to 11 meters. Standing on the ground, it would have been roughly the height of a modern giraffe. It may or may not have spent much time over the sea, and some researchers believe it was primarily a terrestrial animal that strode across the late Cretaceous landscape hunting small animals. But even its presence, at the edge of what flight and skeletal biology can accomplish, tells us something about the late Cretaceous world. Things were still pushing the limits. Evolution was still producing surprises. The world at 67 million years ago, 1 million years before the end of the Cretaceous, was recognizably the same world that we have been exploring throughout this story. Warm, full of large animals, the seas still inhabited by Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs, the skies still crossed by pterosaurs, the land still walked by dinosaurs of every imaginable configuration, but the geological record suggests subtle changes accumulating, a slightly different chemistry in some of the marine sediments, a slight reduction in the diversity of some groups, a shift in the distribution of others. The seaway was narrower. The air was slightly different from what it had been at the peak of the Cretaceous warmth. The volcanic activity from the Deccan province had been adding carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds to the atmosphere for millions of years. The world was not ending. It was changing, which is what the world always does. But this particular round of change was building towards something different from the changes that had come before. Something was coming that the Cretaceous world had no precedent for. No frame of reference, no adaptation to address. You drift in the late Cretaceous sea, in the warm water that is slightly less warm than it was at the height of the period, under skies that are slightly different, in a world that is still magnificently alive but that carries in it, somewhere in the chemistry of the water and the patterns of the currents, a sense of something shifting. The animals around you do not know this. They go about their ancient business. The mosasaur tasting the water with its forked tongue, the plesiosaur sweeping its neck through the middle water, the pterosaur banking overhead on the warm thermals, all of them moving through the last moments of a world that is about to change in a way that not one of them could survive. The last night, 66 million years ago, on an afternoon that was in every visible way indistinguishable from the 10 million afternoons that had preceded it in the Cretaceous. Something entered Earth's atmosphere from space. It had been traveling for a very long time. It had been traveling since before there were animals on this planet. It was an asteroid, approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, moving at a speed that made the concept of speed almost meaningless, and it struck the shallow sea that covered what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, with a force that is genuinely difficult to express in terms that have any purchase on human comprehension. The impact was not a drawn-out event. It was, in geological and even in physical terms, instantaneous. The asteroid vaporized as it hit. The rock below it vaporized. A crater 60 kilometers deep and 180 kilometers across was blasted into the Earth's crust in seconds. The energy released was equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously at a single point. A fireball expanded outward from the impact site, at speeds far beyond anything the biological world had ever experienced. In the immediate area of the impact, nothing survived. This needs no further analysis. But the effects that spread outward from the impact site in the hours, days, and years that followed are what determined the fate of the great Cretaceous creatures. And those effects moved through the atmosphere and through the ocean in ways that were different from anything that had ever happened to the animals living through them. The sea felt the impact almost immediately. The shallow water of the Yucatan region, struck directly by the asteroid, was turned to steam in the initial moments. As the explosion expanded, it generated waves. Not ordinary waves, not the waves produced by a storm or an earthquake, though both of those produce waves in the ocean. These were waves driven by an energy release so far beyond normal geological events that they do not have a good modern analogue. Enormous walls of water moved outward from the impact site in every direction, travelling across the Cretaceous Ocean at speeds that carried them to distant coastlines in hours. The Western Interior Seaway would have felt these waves. The seaway was connected to the impact site by the warm, shallow waters of what is now the Gulf of Mexico, and the waves that travelled north through that connection would have reached the seaway in a matter of hours after impact. How large they were when they arrived is a matter of ongoing research, but evidence from the geological record suggests they were substantial enough to disturb the sediment over wide areas, to overturn communities of bottom-dwelling organisms, to confuse and stress the fish and reptiles that lived in those waters. But the tsunamis, terrible as they were not what killed the great sea reptiles. The killing mechanism of the asteroid impact, for ocean animals as for land animals, was what came after. In the hours after impact, the superheated ejecta from the crater, the vaporized rock and asteroid material that had been blasted into the upper atmosphere at the moment of impact, began to rain back down on Earth. This re-entering material heated the atmosphere to temperatures that may have briefly exceeded the surface temperature of the Sun in some regions. A pulse of intense heat moved across the planet. For animals in the sea, the water offered some protection from this initial heat pulse. The ocean is an excellent thermal buffer. Its enormous heat capacity meant that even a brief period of extreme atmospheric heating would not immediately kill things living below the surface. But the animals that were at the surface, breathing, the Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs that surfaced regularly for air, would have been exposed to the heat pulse in ways that animals deep below the surface were not. This may have been one of the earliest selective pressures of the impact event on marine life. Then came the darkness. The asteroid impact had blasted an enormous quantity of fine dust and soot into the stratosphere, and this material spread around the globe in the weeks following impact, blocking sunlight. For months, possibly for years, the amount of sunlight reaching the surface of the Earth was dramatically reduced. Photosynthesis slowed and then effectively stopped across much of the planet. The plants died. On land, the animals that depended on plants died. In the sea, the phytoplankton, the microscopic photosynthetic organisms that formed the base of the entire ocean food web, went into catastrophic decline. For the ocean food web, the loss of phytoplankton was like removing the first floor of a building. Everything above it depended on it, directly or indirectly. The small animals that ate phytoplankton began to starve. The larger animals that ate those small animals began to starve. The large predators at the top of the food chain, the Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs, found their food supplies diminishing rapidly. They could not adapt, not in the time available to them, not in the weeks and months that the darkness lasted. The Mosasaurs were particularly vulnerable because of their body size. Large animals require large amounts of food. A 15-meter mosasaur, eating a diet of large fish and smaller sea reptiles, needed to consume enormous quantities of food to maintain its body. When the food chains below it began to collapse, the mosasaur had no recourse. It could not shrink. It could not reduce its metabolic demands quickly enough to survive on the reduced food supply. It starved. The fossil record from the very top of the Cretaceous shows mosasaur fossils right up to the KPG boundary, the thin line in the rock that marks the moment of the asteroid impact. And then, above that line, nothing. Not one mosasaur species survived the boundary. Not a single one. After 30 million years of extraordinary success, after transforming from small lizard-like animals into the dominant predators of every ocean on Earth, the mosasaurs ended completely and simultaneously at the same geological moment as the asteroid impact. The fossil record is unambiguous about this. The KPG boundary is one of the clearest and most precisely dated events in all of geology. And on the ocean side of that boundary, the mosasaurs simply stop. The Plesiosaurs stopped too. The long-necked elasmosaurids and polycotylids that had persisted through the decline of the Ichthyosaurs, through the rise and fall of the Pliosaurs, through every environmental change the Mesozoic had produced, ended at the KPG boundary. Animals whose family tree reached back 150 million years, that had successfully occupied every ocean on the planet for the entire span of the age of dinosaurs, found in the darkness and cold that followed the asteroid, impact a challenge that their 150 million years of ocean living had not prepared them for. The pterosaurs ended too. Not all of them instantaneously, perhaps. The extinction event was not truly a single moment, but a prolonged ecological collapse that stretched over thousands of years as the darkness slowly lifted and the ecosystems tried to rebuild from the bottom. But by the time the Cretaceous had officially ended and the Paleogene had begun, the pterosaurs were gone. The skies above the sea were empty of large flying reptiles for the first time since the Triassic. The ocean was not empty. Some things survived. The sharks were barely affected. The bony fish reduced greatly in diversity but did not vanish. The sea turtles lost many species, but not all of them, and the lineages that survived would persist into the modern world. Some small plankton lineages went through the impact with reduced numbers, but did not go extinct. And in the deep ocean, where the cold and darkness were perhaps less dramatically different from the conditions before the impact, some forms of life persisted that would form the seed of the post-Cretaceous ocean. The warm, ancient sea that you have been drifting through in this story was ending. The amber-gold light was going out, not because the sun had moved or the world had turned, but because the sky was filling with something that blocked the light. A fine, dark veil of pulverized rock and carbon, the debris of an impact so total that its effects outlasted the animals that lived through it. The mosasaur, somewhere in the dimming water, felt the temperature change, felt the food becoming scarce, kept swimming because it could do nothing else, through water that was growing colder and darker, in a world that was quietly, without drama, without announcement, ending. The first mosasaur ever recognized by science was found not in Kansas and not in the ocean, but in a chalk quarry near the city of Maastricht, in the Netherlands. This was in 1764, more than 2 centuries ago, when the science of paleontology did not yet exist as a formal discipline, when the concept of extinction was only beginning to be accepted by natural philosophers, and when the idea that enormous reptiles had once inhabited the ancient ocean would have seemed like mythology rather than geology. The skull that the workers found in the quarry was enormous. No one knew what it was. The skull passed through several hands and was debated by several scholars before it reached the attention of the Dutch physician and naturalist Peter Camper, who examined it carefully and concluded that it belonged to a large marine animal of some kind, probably a whale or a large fish. His son Adrian later revised this opinion and suggested it was more like a large monitor lizard. Neither had the full picture, but together they were pointing in the right direction. The skull was, in fact, the skull of a mosasaur, specifically a large specimen of what would later be named Mosasaurus hoffmannii. The name Mosasaurus means Meuse lizard, after the Meuse River near Maastricht, where it was found. The history of this specimen did not end with its scientific description. During the French Revolutionary Wars, when French troops occupied Maastricht in 1794, the skull of the ancient sea reptile became a minor objective of military operations. The city had hidden the specimen to protect it from seizure, but French forces, aware of its scientific value, searched for it and ultimately found it. The skull was transported to Paris, where it remained. It is still there today, in the collection of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, where it has spent more than 2 centuries, serving as one of the foundational specimens of vertebrate paleontology. The discovery of Plesiosaurs has its own extraordinary history, and it begins on the coast of Dorset, England, in the early 19th century, with a woman named Mary Anning. Mary Anning was the daughter of a cabinet maker in the seaside town of Lyme Regis, and she spent much of her life collecting fossils from the unstable cliffs along the Jurassic coast, cliffs that were constantly eroding and constantly releasing new specimens from the ancient limestone. She was not wealthy. She was not educated in the formal sense that the male scientists of her era were educated. She was, however, extraordinarily skilled at finding and extracting fossils, and she had a geological intuition that was recognized even in her lifetime as exceptional. In 1823, Mary Anning found a nearly complete Plesiosaur skeleton in the cliffs near Lyme Regis. It was the first Plesiosaur skeleton to be described scientifically, and when Anning's find was presented to the scientific community, the reaction was skeptical. The animal seemed impossible. The neck was absurdly long. The body plan made no obvious sense to naturalists accustomed to the proportions of living animals. The great anatomist, Georges Cuvier, initially doubted the authenticity of the specimen, suspecting that bones from different animals had been combined to create a fraudulent chimera. It took careful examination to convince him and others that the animal was real, that these proportions were genuine, that the ancient ocean had actually contained creatures built this way. The development of the science of paleontology over the 19th and 20th centuries systematically revealed the full extent of the Cretaceous Sea's diversity. In North America, the famous bone wars between Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh produced not only dinosaur specimens, but also a tremendous quantity of marine reptile material from the Niobrara Chalk Formation. The two men's competing teams found Plesiosaurs, Mosasaurs, pterosaurs, and the toothed birds, Hesperornis and Ichthyornis, all from the ancient seaway floor exposed in Kansas. The rivalry, though often conducted with more drama than dignity, produced a scientific literature that remains foundational. In the 20th century, fossil hunting in the Niobrara Formation and equivalent formations in other parts of the world became increasingly systematic. Amateur collectors, working with and sometimes ahead of professional paleontologists, continued to find remarkable specimens. One of the most famous late Cretaceous marine fossil sites is Monument Rocks in Kansas, a natural formation of chalk spires that rises from the flat Kansas landscape like the ruins of an ancient city. Around and within these formations, fossils of the seaway fauna have been found for generations. The rock itself, that chalk that is entirely made of tiny marine organism shells, is the pressed memory of the ancient water that once covered the plain. The tools of modern paleontology have revealed things about these animals that even 20 years ago could not have been known. Computerized tomography scanning, the same technology used in medical CT scans, allows paleontologists to look inside fossil bones without damaging them, revealing internal structure that was invisible to previous generations of researchers. The inner ear structures of mosasaurs, the growth rings in plesiosaur bones that reveal their age and growth rate, the density of ichthyosaur ribs that speaks to their diving capability. All of these have been revealed by modern scanning technology. Isotope geochemistry has become another powerful tool for understanding these animals. The ratio of different isotopes of oxygen preserved in fossil tooth enamel reflects the body temperature of the animal when the enamel was forming. By measuring these ratios precisely, researchers can determine whether an animal was warm-blooded or cold-blooded, and approximately what temperature its body was maintained at. This is how we know that some mosasaurs maintained elevated body temperatures. This is how we have evidence that plesiosaurs may have been warm-blooded. The chemistry of ancient bones, read with modern instrumentation, has told us things about Cretaceous animal physiology that direct observation could never have provided. Soft tissue preservation, while rare, has been revolutionary in cases where it has occurred. The discovery of mosasaur skin impressions in the late 20th century completely changed the reconstruction of those animals. The forked tongue evidence came from the preservation of structures associated with Jacobson's organ in exceptional specimens. A remarkable specimen from South Dakota, described in the early 21st century, preserved not just bone but traces of skin that allowed researchers to determine that at least some mosasaurs may have been countershaded in their coloration, darker on the dorsal surface and lighter on the ventral surface. In the same way that modern dolphins and sharks are colored, there are still remarkable discoveries being made. In 2020, a paper described a new large mosasaur from Morocco with an unusual dentition, expanding the known diversity of the group in the late Cretaceous Atlantic. In 2019, a study of ichthyosaur reproductive biology, using improved scanning techniques, refined the understanding of how ichthyosaur birth occurred. Each year brings new specimens from new localities and new analytical techniques applied to known specimens. The picture of the Cretaceous ocean is not finished. It is still being assembled, one careful study at a time. What makes this ongoing process of discovery remarkable is the nature of the material being studied. A fossil is not just a dead thing, it is a record. It preserves, in stone, information about a living animal, about the conditions it lived in, about what it ate and how it moved and how it grew. Every fossil is a letter from the deep past, written in the language of chemistry and structure rather than words. Learning to read these letters is the work of paleontology, and the letters from the Cretaceous Sea are among the most detailed and most varied in the entire fossil record. The chalk beds of Kansas and Nebraska, the chalk formations of England and Belgium, the phosphate deposits of Morocco, the limestone formations of Australia where Kronosaurus was found. All of these are libraries of the Cretaceous Ocean, each one preserving a slightly different aspect of the same ancient world. Taken together, they give us a picture of remarkable completeness. Remarkable not because we know everything, but because we know so much more than seemed possible when that first mosasaur skull was pulled from a Dutch quarry in 1764. And still the work continues. There are formations not yet studied in detail. There are specimens in museum collections not yet fully described. There are techniques not yet applied to existing specimens. The Cretaceous Ocean is generous with its information, releasing it slowly, one fossil at a time, over the centuries since we first began to understand what these ancient rocks were trying to tell us. The rocks remember everything. We are still learning to listen. You drift through the warm ancient water of the Cretaceous Sea. And somewhere in the mud below you, in the soft sediment of the seaway floor, the future fossils of today's animals are beginning their slow transformation. The fish that dies near the bottom, settling into the mud before it can be fully scavenged. The mosasaur that sinks in the open water and falls through the layers to the sea floor. The plesiosaur vertebra that separates from a carcass already half consumed. All of them going into the rock. All of them becoming, over millions of years, the stones that will one day be read by patient hands in a world that did not exist when these animals swam. The living legacy. The sea did not end. That is the most important thing to understand as we move through the final pages of this story, as we lift our gaze from the closing moments of the Cretaceous and turn it toward what came after. The asteroids struck. The sky went dark. The food chains collapsed. The mosasaurs starved. The plesiosaurs disappeared. The pterosaurs were gone from the skies. The world was very quiet, and very cold, and very dark, for a period of time that stretched from months into years. But the sea did not end. The ocean did not dry up. The water was still there, still salt, still covering the same enormous area of the planet's surface, still moving in its ancient currents, still receiving sunlight, still, as the darkness gradually lifted over months and years and eventually decades, warming again. The sea was emptied of many of its largest inhabitants, but it was not emptied of all life. And the life that remained had work to do. The sharks survived the KPG extinction with a completeness that is both remarkable and informative. Shark lineages that had existed before the asteroid impact were present after it, reduced in some cases but not eliminated. This survival speaks to something fundamental about the shark body plan: its flexibility, its metabolic efficiency, its ability to go without food for extended periods, its willingness to eat a very wide range of things. The sharks were generalists in a way that the mosasaurs, for all their diversity, were not. When the food chain collapsed, the sharks could find food at levels that the mosasaurs could not sustain themselves on. They survived by being adaptable in ways that the larger, more specialized apex predators could not be. The sea turtles survived too, though barely. Several sea turtle lineages that had existed in the Cretaceous vanished at the KPEG boundary, but 2 or 3 lineages made it through, and those survivors are the ancestors of the sea turtles alive today. When you see a green sea turtle moving through modern tropical waters, you are looking at an animal whose family tree reaches back beyond the asteroid impact, back into the Cretaceous, back to the warm, shallow seas where Archelon swam. The sea turtles that are alive today are living links to the age of the great sea reptiles, changed in detail but recognizable in their fundamental nature. The bony fish, which had been under intense predation pressure from mosasaurs and large sharks and every other predator in the Cretaceous Sea, were among the survivors. Many species were lost. But the basic fish lineages, the teleosts, those ray-finned fish that make up the vast majority of fish species alive today, were present before the impact and present after it. In the aftermath of the extinction, with the large reptile predators gone and the ecological structure of the ocean disrupted, the teleost fish diversified explosively. They moved into every available niche with a speed that the geological record makes visible. The modern ocean, with its extraordinary diversity of bony fish species, is partly a product of that post-Cretaceous diversification. The plankton recovered too, though the recovery was slow and uneven. The microscopic organisms at the base of the food web, those coccolithophores and foraminifera, whose shells had built the chalk deposits of the Cretaceous Sea, were severely affected by the darkness that followed the impact, but they were not entirely eliminated. The lineages that survived the darkness began to diversify again as the light returned. And within millions of years, the planktonic communities of the ocean were again complex and productive, though different in their composition from what had existed before. The recovery of the ocean after the KPG extinction took millions of years. This is not an abstraction. For millions of years, the ocean was a simpler place than it had been. The complex food webs of the Cretaceous, with their multiple trophic levels and their apex predators, and their intricate cycling of energy through different body types, were gone. What remained was the simplified community of survivors, rebuilding the complexity from the bottom up, one species at a time, one relationship at a time, one generation at a time. But life, as it always does, came back. And when it came back differently. The niches left empty by the Mosasaurs were not immediately filled by something equivalent. There was a period after the extinction when the ocean's largest predators were, by the standards of the Cretaceous, relatively modest in size. But gradually, over millions of years, the whales evolved their return to the sea. The ancestors of the great whales were land animals in the early Eocene period, roughly 50 million years ago, and they made the same journey back to the water that the Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs and Ichthyosaurs had made before them, pulled by the same logic of abundant food and the same ocean that had been waiting to receive them. Whales today are the closest ecological equivalent to the Mosasaurs in the modern ocean. Not because they are related, not because they evolved from the same ancestors, but because they have taken on the same ecological role. Large, warm-blooded, air-breathing, highly intelligent predators at or near the top of the ocean food chain. The sperm whale, diving into the deep in pursuit of giant squid, echoes the great-eyed ichthyosaurs that made the same dive for the same prey 60 million years before. The killer whale, hunting in coordinated groups, echoes whatever social behavior the mosasaurs may have practiced when they drove schools of fish through the seaway. The pattern repeats because the ocean provides the same resources and the same opportunities, and evolution finds the same solutions. But the whales are not the ocean dinosaurs. They are something different. Something that arose in the space left by the ocean dinosaurs passing. The mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, the ichthyosaurs, these are gone in a way that is complete and final. Their lineages ended at the KPG boundary. Their descendants are not swimming anywhere in the modern ocean. What they left behind is not biological descendants, but ecological opportunity. The empty shape of the niche they once occupied, the space in the ocean that the whales eventually filled. When you look at a modern ocean, you are looking at a world built on the bones of the Cretaceous Sea. The chemistry of the ocean today was shaped by what happened at the KPG boundary and by the millions of years of recovery that followed. The distribution of ocean life today reflects the survival and extinction patterns of the mass extinction event. The deep water currents that circulate through the modern ocean are the descendants of currents that were present in the Cretaceous Sea, modified by 66 million years of continental drift and climate change, but recognizable in their fundamental logic. The chalk that forms the white cliffs of Dover is the physical remains of the Cretaceous Sea. When you hold a piece of chalk, you are holding the compressed shells of countless billions of tiny organisms that lived in the warm Cretaceous water, organisms that absorbed carbon dioxide from the ancient atmosphere and built their shells from it and died and sank and accumulated in layers that became stone. The chemistry of the ancient ocean is preserved in those shells. The conditions of the Cretaceous Sea are encoded in the isotopes of those compressed calcium carbonate shells. Every ocean today is in some sense the Cretaceous ocean, older, changed, cooled, restocked with different species, but carrying in its chemistry and its currents and its fundamental nature the legacy of everything that came before: the mosasaur that tasted the water with its forked tongue, the plesiosaur that swept its long neck through the ancient schools of fish, the ichthyosaur with its enormous eyes finding prey in the deep dark water. All of them were part of an ocean that is the ancestor of the ocean that exists today. The sea does not forget. It carries everything forward. You are drifting now, at the end of this story, in water that is not quite as warm as the Cretaceous Sea was, not quite as full as the Cretaceous Sea was, not quite the same amber gold in the light. The Mosasaurs are gone, the Plesiosaurs are gone, the great pterosaurs are gone. The seaway that divided North America has been dry land for 66 million years. But the ocean is still here. The water is still here. The light still comes down through the surface in long columns, changing color as it goes deeper. And somewhere in the deep water, in the places that the light does not reach, in the currents that have been circulating since before we existed, the legacy of the ancient sea continues, not in the bodies of living animals, because those animals are truly gone, but in the chemistry of the water, in the structure of the sediment, in the pattern of the currents, in the logic of the ecosystem that the Cretaceous Sea built and the modern ocean inherited. The ancient ocean is still here, hidden inside the ocean we know, patient as stone, warm in its memory of a warmer time. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through the ancient sea, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us continue making more content like this. Anyways, see you in the next one. You have been in the water for a long time now, drifting through 90 million years, through warm ancient seas, through the lives and deaths of creatures whose shapes will not be repeated in any ocean this world will ever again produce. The Mosasaurs, the Plesiosaurs, the Ichthyosaurs, the Pliosaurs, all of them have passed through this story the way things pass through water, leaving their shape in it briefly before the water closes and smooths and returns to itself. Let the water hold you now. Just the water. Warm, ancient, patient. The amber light is very soft here, at this depth, at this hour. It comes down from somewhere far above, from a sun so distant in time, that its light, by the time it reaches you, has travelled not just through space but through 66 million years of history. The light falls on you the way it falls on everything that rests below the surface, gently, without preference, without hurry. Your body is heavy in the best way. The way that comes after a long journey, after you have covered a great distance and arrived at somewhere quiet. You have been to the bottom of the Cretaceous Ocean and back. You have seen the shapes that moved there, the long necks and the enormous skulls and the streamlined bodies and the enormous eyes. You have heard the water move around them. You have felt the ancient warmth. All of that is behind you now, settling the way sediment settles, drifting slowly down toward the floor of sleep. You do not need to hold any of it. You do not need to remember. The ocean keeps its own records, in chalk and stone and compressed shell, and it will hold these stories until long after you and I are part of the record ourselves. Let the water carry you. Let the ancient warmth of that long-gone sea travel through the stone of 66 million years and reach you here, in the present, in the dark behind your closed eyes. The Mosasaur swims in that darkness, long and patient. The Plesiosaur trails its impossible neck through the deep. The Ichthyosaur, with its great eye, turns slowly in the water and looks at you, calm and curious, and then looks away. Sleep. The ancient sea is very quiet. It has been quiet for 66 million years, and it will be quiet for as long as you need. The water is warm. The light is old. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do but let yourself go, down into the soft and ancient dark, where the ocean floor is very far below and the surface is very far above, and in between there is only the warm water and the slow movement of enormous things living out their ancient lives in the world before memory. Good night. Dream of the deep sea. Dream of warm water and amber light, and shapes that are too large to fully see. Moving with patience in a world that the ocean still remembers. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I am always curious about that. And if you have a topic you would like to hear next, leave it in the comments. Sleep well.